Summer is coming, and you need to get jacked fast. Or maybe you got a wedding coming up, or a vacation. Whatever it is, it's a story as old as time. Maybe you haven't been working out, or maybe you have, but just slacking. But all of a sudden, you get a fire lit under your butt and decide you need to put on some muscle. So what are you going to do? Work out every day for hours and hours? Well, that isn't going to work. So in this video, we're going to show you what does work and go over a list of tips, tricks, and hacks to optimize your training and ensure as much muscle growth as possible. Muscle growth, or muscle hypertrophy, is one of the primary goals a person will have when going to the gym, alongside losing weight and gaining strength. As such, building muscle faster is on everyone's mind when they first head to the gym, but trainees will soon discover an inconvenient truth. Building muscle is a pretty slow process, at least much slower than many expect. Unfortunately, our bodies have decided that gaining fat should be really easy, while building muscle needs a good amount of time and effort. And there's an evolutionary reason for that. Basically, fat acts as energy storage, something you always need. Muscle, on the other hand, is actually more metabolically demanding, meaning your body only wants more muscle if it's absolutely necessary. We know understanding why doesn't make this fact any more convenient, but it is what it is. With that said, your muscle growth can be affected by a range of variables. For example, your training age, intensity, genetics, and nutrition all factor in. With that in mind, the average rate of muscle growth can still vary greatly. For example, in 2005, 585 men were put on a 12-week progressive resistance training plan. When they measured the biceps, the change in size varied from a whopping 55% to a decrease in muscle size of -5%. That is a huge range, and you could fall anywhere on it. Now, within the ton of variables that can affect your muscle growth, there is only one that you have no control over: your genetics. This is good news because it means you have a ton of areas that you can optimize to maximize your muscle growth. If you're not, you're more than likely slowing down your maximum growth. And it's these areas that we're going to discuss in this video. There's no singular action that you can perform to magically double the size of your guns. However, there are plenty of variables that you can control that will each offer an advantage and compound on one another. What this ultimately means is to, quote, double your growth, you're going to need to optimize, and that includes your training, your recovery, nutrition, and supplementation. So it's up to you. You can either sabotage yourself by not optimizing, or you can maximize your growth. First up is nutrition. Nutrition is going to play a huge role in your muscle growth as it's literally feeding the muscle growth. And let's get some basics out of the way. In order to grow, you're going to need calories, but not too many as you'll gain a lot of fat as well. For this reason, the general guideline for muscle growth is to get in a 300 to 500 calorie surplus. This is enough to fuel muscle growth while mitigating much fat gain. For example, a study put two groups together to test if you can force feed muscle. In other words, can you eat a ton of food to force muscle growth? The big bulk group ate 600 more calories than the normal bulk group, yet they barely gained any more muscle. What they did gain was a whole lot more fat. So we know simply eating a ton isn't going to help with muscle gain. As you're in a caloric surplus, you have a bit more wiggle room with your macronutrient breakdown as far as calories go. Your macronutrients, also termed macros, are where you get your calories from, and they come in three forms of nutrients which your body requires large portions of. They are protein, fat, and carbs. When deciding what your food should consist of in terms of these macros, follow these rules. For protein, aim to eat 1.6 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. Your fat should make up 30% of your calorie intake, and you fill all the rest of your calories with carbs. Simple. Now, assuming you got that covered, let's look at a couple of details to maximize growth with just your protein intake. You want to spread your protein out evenly amongst 4 to 5 meals, making sure each meal has a minimum of 20 grams. This will ensure that you have a steady release of amino acids throughout the day, which could result in more muscle mass. This was demonstrated in a study where total protein intake was spread out across the day in 3 meals. One group had an even protein distribution, while the other got most of their protein in one meal. And the lopsided distribution actually ate more protein too. After 12 weeks of resistance training, the evenly distributed group gained 2.5 kilograms of muscle mass, while the lopsided group gained only 1.8 kilograms. That might not look like a ton, but it'll add up as we go. Next up is sleep. If you're getting proper sleep, you're letting your body go roughly 8 to 12 hours without giving your muscles any fuel. Here's the thing, your muscles don't sleep. This period of time led researchers to ask, what would happen if you ate a large amount of protein right before going to sleep? As it turns out, you grow muscle. A meta-analysis from 2021 concluded that consuming 20 to 40 grams of casein protein 30 minutes before sleep elevates muscle protein synthesis overnight. This resulted in improving recovery and potentially greater muscle size. Another study from 2017 used a pre-sleep shake of 27.5 grams of protein and 15 grams of carbohydrate. They then took part in an 8-week resistance training program along with a group who took no pre-sleep protein drink. The quads of the pre-sleep protein group grew 8.4 centimeters, while the placebo group grew 2.4 centimeters. In addition, the type 2 fibers, also known as fast-twitch muscle fibers of the pre-sleep group, grew basically twice as much as the placebo group. This is really good news for lifters. You see, your body has different size muscle fibers that are distinguished by their role. Type 2 muscle fibers are able to support high amounts of force for quick, powerful movements, things like sprinting and lifting weights. Then there's creatine. If you're not taking creatine, you're doing it wrong. Creatine is by far the most potent compound that has a positive effect on muscle growth, and it's actually the only compound which can literally double your muscle size twice as fast. Take this study from 2017. In it, 2 groups used an 8-week training period. Each variable was the same, except that one group consumed creatine. Their dosing consisted of a 7-day loading with 4 doses of 0.3 grams per kilogram a day. This was then followed by a 7-week maintenance phase of a single dose of 0.03 grams per kilogram per day. 3 areas of the body were measured: upper limbs, lower limbs, and the trunk. Here's a comparison of the increased growth in these parts. Upper body, 7.1% versus 1.6%. That's 4.4 times as much. Lower body, 3.2% versus 0.7%. That's 4.5 times as much. Trunk, 2.1% versus 0.7%. That's 3 times as much. So yeah, if you want muscle twice as fast, start taking creatine. But now that your belly's full, let's look at how you can tweak your training inside the gym to maximize your growth. Let's start by addressing the question we asked in the intro: is working out for hours and hours the best way to get big fast? As it turns out, spending 3 hours in the gym destroying your muscles may not be the best way to go about building muscle. More is better only to an extent. However, you'll cross a threshold where you're not going to see any more results, and in fact, you could actually be doing too much damage to recover from. How much should you do? Well, with all the research we have, it seems as though muscles are optimized with just 10 to 20 sets per week. Therefore, no need to perform 20 types of curls on the same day. So then, how should we train? Bro splits, or training a single body part in a single session once a week, tend to be the go-to training split for those looking to get pumped up. While they obviously work, research actually shows there may be a better option. Studies show that training a muscle 2 times a week is superior to just 1. There may even be benefits to hitting a muscle 3 times a week. However, this likely only pertains to smaller muscles as they need less recovery time. So why is more than once a week better? Well, there are a couple theories. The first is that it allows you to train a muscle with more volume at a higher frequency. When you train a single muscle one day, by the end you're fatigued and just not training as hard. Another reason might have to do with a threshold existing with volume. Once you train a muscle so much in a day, doing more has little or no benefit. Whatever the reason, it seems training once is cutting you short. Therefore, cut the number of exercises in half and train them on 2 different days to stay fresh and maximize adaptations. The next tip is pretty cool and relatively new. You've probably noticed that some exercises are harder at different locations. Some in the long position where the muscle is stretched out, while others in the short position when they're almost flexed. What this new theory says is that using exercises that challenge the muscle in the long position can produce more muscle growth. This will make more sense if we visualize it. So let's compare the overhead triceps extension to the triceps pushdown. In the overhead position, the triceps are stretched farther, meaning in theory, these should produce more growth. And that's exactly what a study in 2023 found out. There, the overhead extension produced 1.5 times more muscle. Another study from 2022 found that preacher curls also produced 1.5 times more growth than incline curls. Next, why is it that eccentric muscle contraction never gets any love? It seems everyone only cares about the concentric. And what are we even talking about? Well, your body has 3 different types of contractions: concentric, eccentric, and isometric. Your concentric contraction is when the muscle is pulling and getting shorter. Think about the up phase of a biceps curl. An isometric contraction occurs when the muscle fibers don't move, holding a limb in place like a wall squat. And finally, the eccentric. The eccentric is when the muscle lengthens, or the going down phase. If you're somebody who just lets the weight drop during the eccentric contraction, you're performing it a disservice. You see, studies have found that the eccentric muscle contraction is able to produce greater force than the concentric, as well as more muscle damage. For example, a meta-analysis from 2017 examined the use of concentric-only and eccentric-only muscle action. They concluded that the eccentric contraction was responsible for a greater increase in muscle growth at 10% versus 6.8%. In fact, it's believed the difference in time spent on the eccentric could partially explain differences in muscle growth when the same number of reps are performed. Now, this of course doesn't mean you should only do the eccentric contraction, but what it does mean is to slow down on the eccentric and lower the weight in a slow and controlled manner. Take 2 to 3 seconds. And while you might just be starting out, if you've been to the gym for any length of time, you have likely heard some bro science that says to use different exercises to hit the muscles from different angles. Well, it turns out your gym buddy is right on this one, and you really should, and it's backed by science. We have one study that actually comes from back in 2000. In it, the researchers discovered that a muscle would develop in a regional specific manner dependent on the exercise and where it exerts stress on the muscle. In other words, you can see different amounts of growth on the same muscle from a single exercise. Only hit a muscle one way, and it'll be lopsided. The author clearly states that no single exercise can maximize the hypertrophic response of all regions of a particular muscle. For maximal hypertrophy of an entire muscle, athletes, particularly bodybuilders, are justified in incorporating various exercises that purportedly stimulate growth in a regional specific manner. Therefore, be sure to use various exercises to hit a muscle. If all you're doing is bench press for the chest, you're gonna miss out on muscle growth. In addition, don't use 2 exercises with similar biomechanics. For example, if you're training chest with 3 exercises, it wouldn't make sense to train bench press, push-ups, and flat bench dumbbell press, as they all have similar motions. Instead, your training should look like bench press, incline dumbbell press, and decline chest fly. This is one reason why we all love the crossover cables so much. No other piece of equipment will allow you to hit a muscle at so many different angles. Another piece of bro science that's 100% legit is to get your pump on. But what the heck does that even mean? Well, if you were to ask a bodybuilder, it would be to perform an exercise with a very light weight with high reps until the muscle is engorged with blood. This blood would then cause the muscle to swell up and look bigger. In the past, though, we didn't fully understand what was going on. Now we do. The pump has even been granted a more scientific term, cell swelling. Doesn't have quite the same ring to it as the pump, but we'll explain what's happening. When we train a muscle, the veins of the muscle will close off while the arteries keep flowing. This ignites a series of events that basically leaves the muscle becoming engorged with blood. At the same time, it results in the accumulation of various metabolites. Originally, we simply thought this was a transient experience with short-term benefits. However, research has shown this to have long-lasting chronic benefits. Basically, this state of engorged muscle creates a highly anabolic environment. As a result, several hypertrophic reactions are believed to be ignited, such as an increase in satellite cell activity and the favoring net protein balance. There are many ways to achieve a pump, but Dr. Brad Schoenfeld provides 3 in what's probably the first study to look at the pump through a scientific lens. 1. Use 2 to 3 sets of high reps, for example 20 or so, with 60 seconds rest. 2. Use 5 to 10 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions with 30 seconds rest. And 3. Use a drop set. That is, perform an exercise until a few reps before failure, decrease the load 25 to 50%, and perform another set. Now, you're not doing this for every exercise. In fact, most of your work should be done using a medium rep range of around 6 to 12. Dr. Brad Schoenfeld sums this up by saying, therefore, individuals seeking maximal hypertrophy should consider dedicating a component of their training sessions toward pump training, ideally after heavier strength work. We want to emphasize the component part of that quote. Don't make this your whole routine. Perform just 1 or 2 pump exercises at the end of every session, hitting 2 different muscles. Now, let's all be honest for a second and have a hard talk. Ask yourself, do you really leave it all on the gym floor every session? Chances are probably not. And that's not a dig, as it's simply human nature. We're all guilty of not giving it our all every single time, which is where a gym buddy can become a huge help. And studies clearly show that unsupervised training leads to lower intensity, lower reps, and lower load selection. In fact, a meta showed that on average, unsupervised trainees will generally pick a load equal to 53% of their 1-rep max and stop as much as 10 reps before failure. Your 1-rep max is the maximum amount of weight you can lift in one time. It's as strong as you get. Therefore, let's pretend your 1-rep max is 100 pounds. 53% is 53 pounds. You might think, sure, but not me, as I've been in the gym long enough. Well, while your ability to push yourself does increase as you train more, it happens to trained individuals as well. A study from 2023 put 36 young resistance-trained men and women on an 8-week training program, half of them supervised and half not. The supervised group improved significantly more in just about every variable tested, including greater muscle growth of the triceps and quads, as well as greater increase in strength. While this doesn't necessarily mean you need a coach, training with a partner could be exactly what you need for more muscle growth faster. And finally, sleep. You probably hear this a lot, but it is true. And it's probably the single most influential behavior you can change for instant results. And that's not hyperbole. Just one night of sleep deprivation can break down protein and increase fat storage. This is thought to be due to a list of factors, but the leading cause is hormone dysregulation. For example, just 1 week of sleep deprivation decreased the testosterone levels of healthy young men by 10 to 15%. So if you're lacking on sleep, you're automatically blunting your body's ability to put on more muscle mass. So now we've shown you a bunch of areas where you could improve your training and tips you can start implementing right now. While we can't promise you'll always build muscle twice as fast, you should see some big differences fairly soon. So to summarize, for your training, 1. Use a split that allows you to hit a muscle twice a week. You can even experiment hitting smaller muscles, triceps and biceps, 3 times a week. 2. Use at least one exercise that trains the muscle in a long state. 3. Use exercises that hit the muscle from different areas. At the same time, stay away from exercises that train the muscle with the same biomechanics in the same session. 4. Slow down your eccentric contraction to 2 to 3 seconds in a controlled manner. 5. Use pump work for 1 to 2 exercises at the end of your program, hitting different muscles. This should be done with smaller isolation exercises, aiming to hit every muscle group once each week. And 6. Be sure to train with intensity. Each set should come within a few reps of failure. If you need help, start training with a friend to push you. For your nutrition, 1. Get in a caloric surplus of 300 to 500 calories. 2. Eat 1.6 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Have 30% of your total calories from fat, then fill the rest in with carbs. 3. Spread your protein out throughout the day with the minimum feeding being 20 grams. 4. Consider a pre-sleep protein shake of 20 to 40 grams of casein 30 minutes before sleep. And 5. Supplement with creatine using a loading phase of 20 to 25 grams for around 5 days, followed by a single dose of 3 to 5 grams. And last, just sleep more. You literally don't have to do anything. 7 to 9 hours should be enough for most. Now, don't expect to see results right after your first workout. The reality is you will still need time to see some noticeable results. At that same time, the only way to build muscle twice as fast is to get your training honed in from the start. Remember, one late night could throw you off. Therefore, be consistent with these habits. Have you heard of creatine? Of course you have. At least you have if you've listened to our channel for any length of time. The reason we talk about it so much is because we love it, and it's essentially the most effective supplement on the market, or so we say. We decided it's time to give creatine its own video, dig into the finer details of this amazing compound, and answer the big question, does creatine actually build muscle? While it's only come to be popular among athletes since the 1990s, creatine has been around for much longer. Much longer. In fact, creatine was first discovered way back in 1832 by the French philosopher and scientist Michel-Eugène Chevreul. From there, it went through a long process of discoveries building off one another. For example, in 1847, the German chemist Justus von Liebig discovered that wild animals have more creatine in their muscles than their domestic cousins. This led to the conclusion that the levels of activity influenced the amount of creatine produced. So even 180 years ago, we knew creatine had an important relationship to physical activity. Supplementation was then found to increase creatine stores in animals in 1912, and eventually used for humans the first time in 1926. By the 1950s, it was clear that supplementation definitely had a positive effect on the human body. Then in the 1990s, athletes learned that they could get a competitive edge by taking creatine, and it's estimated that 80% of the athletes in the 1996 Atlanta Olympics supplemented with it. From there, its popularity and effectiveness have only grown. It's now one of the very few supplements that the majority of experts say athletes and lifters should use. With that said, we want to ask you, have you ever actually looked at the studies behind its use? Or have you ever heard a more detailed explanation of what exactly creatine is, or why we even supplement with it? Well, you're going to now. The rest of this video is dedicated to the inner workings of creatine, so you can know the mechanisms behind the emergence of creatine as the most effective supplement on the market. In order to fully comprehend why creatine works in building muscle, notice we said why, not if it works, you need to know how it works. Understanding the mechanism is paramount to understanding its effectiveness. There's quite a bit going on, but trust us, once you fully understand it, you'll have no question if it builds muscle. Let's dig in. So the first thing you need to understand is that creatine is not a steroid or anything like that. In fact, it's not even a foreign substance. Right now, you and every single person has creatine in their body. In fact, if you didn't, you wouldn't be able to function at all. We'll get into that later, so let's move on with how it works. As we now know, creatine isn't a steroid, so what is it? Well, it's a non-proteinogenic amino acid, an amino acid that's not used in the formation of protein. While it's not used to form protein, it still has very special duties, as you'll soon see, but we'll tell you it has to do with building muscle. Due to its physiological role, the body will collect creatine in its natural stores through one of two pathways. The first pathway is through our diet. Creatine is only found in animal products, primarily red meat and fish. If you're an omnivore, meaning you eat meat and plants, about 50% of your stores will be collected this way through your diet. So what about vegans? Well, vegans will typically have significantly lower stores than meat eaters, as they're stuck with only the second pathway to fill their stores, the internal synthesis of creatine from the amino acids methionine, glycine, and arginine in the liver. Regardless, either from your diet or internal synthesis, creatine is then transported to your stores within your body. About 95% is stored in your muscles, with the remaining 5% being stored in the brain and testes. However, before it's stored, creatine goes through a reaction that adds a phosphate molecule, changing it into a compound known as phosphocreatine. It's this addition of the phosphate that makes creatine so important. Before we go further, we need to talk about another compound, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP for short. ATP is known as your body's energy currency. It's responsible for providing energy for every single muscle contraction. As its name implies, adenosine triphosphate contains 3 phosphate compounds. When energy is required, one of these phosphate molecules will break off, which releases energy that can be used for muscle contraction. The problem here is that you have a finite amount of ATP, and every time an ATP molecule loses a phosphate to provide energy, it leaves a compound known as ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. The di indicates that it now only has 2 phosphate groups, so now it's not capable of providing energy. Remember what we said about a phosphate group being added to creatine? Well, you can probably guess why that's important now. When energy is required fast, the phosphate group from the phosphocreatine breaks off, and it will donate it to a molecule of ADP, thus creating another molecule of ATP. Here, we need to note that this process specifically happens to provide energy for high-intense anaerobic events, such as lifting weights and sprinting. When it comes to aerobic training, there are other mechanisms to resynthesize ATP which are beyond the scope of this video. So in short, when energy is needed fast, the stored phosphocreatine is used to supply a phosphate molecule to ADP to form ATP, which can then be used for energy. The thing is, just like our ATP, our creatine stores are also finite. Think of it like a gas tank. Depending on your diet, the average person's creatine stores are only 60 to 80% full. When creatine is used, this level drops, thus limiting your body's ability to continue performing high-intense events and forcing your body to slow down. And so, we have now arrived at why we supplement with creatine. By taking a creatine supplement, we're able to fill up our creatine stores to 100%. Having full creatine stores then allows us to perform more work in the gym. This equates to performing a couple more reps or the ability to add a little more weight. It basically allows us to increase our work volume. Now imagine if you could go to the gym and add 5 to 10 kilograms to your lifts, or add a couple reps to all your lifts. What would happen? You'd get bigger and stronger. So it's this extra work that full creatine stores allow by way of greater energy that is then translated into more muscle, greater strength gains, and improvements in general athletic performance. Dr. Richard Kreider, the leading expert on creatine supplementation, summarizes the benefits of creatine supplementation, saying you can see the following benefits. Quote, improve maximal power and strength 5 to 15%, work performed during sets of maximal effort muscle contractions 5 to 15%, single effort sprint performance 1 to 5%, and work performed during repetitive sprint performance 5 to 15%. So, in a nutshell, creatine works by providing the body with a greater ability to synthesize more fuel to perform more work, which translates into greater adaptations. Simple and effective. As you can see, creatine supplementation works because creatine works. It's like saying that filling up your gas tank before taking a drive will allow you to drive further. There's no debate, it just does. While we could stop there, there are actually more mechanisms by which creatine works. For example, it's been found that creatine supplementation can improve satellite cell signaling. Satellite cells are a type of specialized stem cell located on the periphery of muscle fibers, which is what gives them their names. Studies have shown that they play a key role in the growth, repair, and regeneration of skeletal muscle. Therefore, satellite cell signaling simply refers to an increase in the capability to communicate with each other, which in turn leads to better muscle recovery and growth. As creatine improves this signaling, the body's able to synthesize muscle more efficiently. In addition, creatine also increases cell hydration. Now, this one needs explanation, as a common criticism is that creatine makes you gain water weight. In truth, it does. However, this is actually a good thing. Let's keep in mind that your muscles are 75% water. What this means is that a bigger muscle is obviously going to hold more water. While there might be some water retention in the first week or so, in the long term, as your muscles grow, water retention is evened out in proportion to your muscle gain. This review from 2022 sums it up by saying, while there is some evidence to suggest that creatine supplementation increases water retention, primarily attributed to increases in intercellular volume, over the short term, there are several other studies suggesting it does not alter total body water, intra or extracellular, relative to muscle mass over long periods of time. More importantly, a hydrated cell is more anabolic. The exact mechanisms aren't fully understood, but researchers know the swelling of a cell signals anabolic growth. Therefore, creatine increases the hydration of the muscles, which then creates a more anabolic environment, which means bigger muscles. Yet another mechanism, creatine has also been found to be responsible for lowering myostatin levels. Myostatin is a protein that's in charge of regulating muscle growth, specifically by inhibiting it. In other words, having higher myostatin levels means less ability to grow muscle. However, as creatine lowers myostatin levels, it increases your body's ability to grow muscle. And we're not done yet. There's also evidence that creatine reduces protein breakdown as well as increasing the anabolic hormone IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor. Now, let's look closer at what all this means for you. For starters, creatine supplementation can improve your recovery. If you're a regular viewer of our channel, you'll know how often we speak about the importance of recovery, as it's one of the primary indicators of how much work you can do. If you can recover faster, you can do more work and see better results. Creatine does improve recovery, which actually happens through several mechanisms. After intense exercise, your body's glycogen stores will largely be depleted. In order to recover faster, it's imperative for you to restore these levels ASAP, and this is what creatine does. When taken with large amounts of carbohydrates, 50 to 90 grams, creatine will cause a better absorption of glucose. At the same time, it'll help maintain muscle glycogen levels during exercise. This is also one of the mechanisms by which creatine can help maintain performance levels during the initial phases of high-volume training, especially when compared to no supplementation. This allows you to perform more work, which again means more muscle. Working in unison with this is the fact that creatine also has been shown to decrease inflammatory markers. All of these work together to improve the recovery of athletes so they can work more. Another awesome benefit, especially for those who train in warm climates, is that it helps increase the tolerance to heat. Actually, this is another benefit that comes by way of the extra cell swelling. The extra hydration reduces the body's thermoregulatory and cardiovascular responses. For example, those who supplement with creatine while training in heat experience a lower sweat rate and lower internal temperatures. Still, these benefits can be seen to some degree in anybody who trains with high intensity. If you get hot while training, creatine can help. So now that you understand how it works and more of its mechanisms, we can take a closer look at what type of effect it has on the body. Probably the main reason people take creatine is to increase muscle mass. Interestingly, one of the older studies from 1999 has some of the most impressive results. It showed that when combined with a resistance training program, muscle fibers see 2 to 3 times more growth than without. Since then, we've had a plethora of new studies. After long-term supplementation, the average creatine user still gains about twice as much muscle mass when compared to non-users. This equates to an extra 2 to 4 kilograms. And to be clear, this is lean body mass, not just weight gain. It's pretty clear why this is. When we look at muscle hypertrophy, the greatest indicator of muscle growth is an increase in total volume. In fact, there is a clear dose response. As creatine allows more work, you can perform more volume and see more muscle growth. Due to its mechanisms, creatine is also highly effective at increasing strength, power, and general performance variables. In terms of strength, you can expect to see results pretty quickly, like in less than 2 weeks. Some users will see an added increase of 15% in their strength, while the average can expect to see an increase of 8%. We should note these gains seem to improve intermittent types of activities. As you're likely planning on using creatine for longer than 2 weeks, let's look at the long-term effects. First, in contrast to short-term, taking creatine long-term seems to allow a trainee to increase their overall work capacity through an extended period of time. The strength seems to include both maximal strength values and muscle endurance. For example, a group of powerlifters saw a significant increase in their 3-repetition maximum or 3RM bench press. The control group still saw significant increases in their 3RM by 2.5 kilograms. However, the creatine group saw an increase of 8.9 kilograms. In addition, the creatine group saw a 37% increase in maximum repetitions of 85% of their 3RM, while the control didn't even see a significant change. In another study, 19 resistance-trained men followed a 12-week training program, with half using creatine supplementation. At the end of the study, the creatine group saw a significantly greater increase across numerous tests. For example, they saw a greater increase in bench press of 24% versus 16%, as well as squats of 32% versus 24%. It was also found that the creatine group saw a greater increase in the cross-sectional areas of type 1 muscle fibers, 35% versus 11%, type 2A muscle fibers, 36% versus 15%, and type 2AB, 35 versus 6%. At the same time, they also saw a greater increase in total gains of lean muscle mass, 6.3% versus 3.1%. We could go on, as the vast majority of studies on creatine see similar results. You should also understand that these increased adaptations transfer into an increase in actual athletic performance. To date, creatine has been tested on a plethora of athletes competing in very different sports. This includes resistance training, elite soccer training, canoe basic training, and plyometric training. Performance in all of these sports saw significant improvements. In terms of widespread consensus that creatine is an effective ergogenic aid, the ISSN, or International Society of Sports Nutrition, reports. Thus, a widespread consensus now exists in the scientific community that creatine supplementation can serve as an effective nutritional ergogenic aid that may benefit athletes involved in numerous sports as well as individuals involved in exercise training. But what about that one guy who said it actually doesn't work because he used it with no gains? Well, even though creatine is highly effective, there are such people as non-responders. These are people who see no benefits to creatine supplementation. The most likely cause of this is that their stores are already full due to their diet. Therefore, any extra supplementation is not absorbed as the stores are already full. The good news is that approximately 80% of people will see significant increases in creatine stores that are greater than 10%. Then 6.6% are quasi-responders, which means they'll see an increase of 5 to 10% in their stores. The remaining 13.4% are non-responders, meaning they see less than 5% improvement. So there is an 80% chance you're going to see some awesome results. As you can easily get a month's supply for less than $20, it is very worth your while. So now we know that creatine works for the large majority of people. We're going to show you how to use creatine most effectively. Now remember when we talked about what taking creatine as a supplement ultimately does. It fills our body's creatine stores. This takes time to do. You can simply do this by taking a normal dose, which is 3 to 5 grams a day. However, this can take up to a whole month. Therefore, the most common practice is to perform a loading phase. A loading phase is 5 to 7 consecutive days in which you take 20 to 25 grams of creatine throughout your day. This will fill up your stores quickly. From there, you can then simply take a maintenance dose of 3 to 5 grams a day. Now, let's get back to your loading phase. Some people might claim gastric distress or other discomfort when taking so much. However, it's usually exacerbated when taking bigger loads. Therefore, you can break the 20 to 25 grams into as small a serving as you want throughout the day. In fact, you can do this for your maintenance dose as well if needed. As far as creatine timing, it doesn't really matter when you take creatine. A meta-analysis from 2018 suggests that taking creatine immediately after training may produce larger gains in muscle mass. However, subsequent studies report there is no clear time that produce greater benefits. With that said, we do think that taking creatine post-workout may be a good idea. This mainly comes down to the recovery aspect. Remember that taking creatine with carbs and protein can enhance the absorption of muscle glycogen. As many of you are already making a protein shake, it just makes sense to go ahead and dump a serving of creatine in as well. Now let's talk about different versions of creatine. The original type of creatine to hit the market was creatine monohydrate. At the same time, this is the type of creatine the vast amount of studies that report positive results used. However, as creatine has gained more and more attention over the years in the general population, it's become a big seller. As a result, different variations have been produced, all of which claim to be superior to creatine monohydrate. Generally, that it's better absorbed. This includes creatine ethyl ester, creatine hydrochloride, and buffered creatine. They also come with a higher price tag. The problem is that as of today, there's only been a small number of studies directly comparing these to creatine monohydrate, and those that have aren't impressive at all. The majority show no significant benefit. In fact, some studies even show that monohydrate actually results in greater changes in muscle creatine content. With that said, getting a quality creatine monohydrate or micronized creatine monohydrate is all you need. With all that in mind, creatine is now being studied for its benefits that reach much farther than just improving performance in the gym. Creatine has been found to mitigate muscle atrophy from immobilization or sarcopenia in the elderly. It's also been found to be a powerful neuroprotector and can improve cognition. And we're even looking at possible benefits for brain concussions. In fact, the list goes on and will likely continue to grow. This is why we say when it comes to creatine, if you're not taking it, you're missing out. Creatine is by far the most studied and most effective supplement on the market, and there is really no comparison. There's also very little, if any, debate. Due to its vast range of uses, just about everyone, lifters and non-lifters alike, can see some benefits from taking creatine. It can be a family affair, but in all seriousness, if you're interested in lifting and fitness, which you obviously are, we would strongly recommend you give creatine a go. Have you ever been chugging down a protein shake before an intense workout session and wondered, does this thing actually help, or am I just guzzling down money that I could be spending on protein-rich meals instead? Then worry no more, because we've got the answers. They just may not be what you think. Oh, and be sure to stick around for the end. We'll walk you through exactly how much and when to consume your protein for optimal results. Whether it works or not, protein supplements are big business. The sports supplement industry rakes in over $27 billion every year, and rising. While we'd love to say the supplement industry only cares about your health and puts your health over profit, we can't. At the end of the day, the supplement industry is like any other industry whose primary job is to make money, so we just can't take those companies at their word on the effectiveness of their products. While some health and workout supplements veer on the side of snake oil, it's not quite the same with protein powder. Why? Because at its core, protein powder is just processed food. So why take it other than real food when you're looking to build mass fast? During the refining process that turns raw food into protein powder, protein is extracted from real food sources and is then broken down further into a fine powder. What this does is it breaks down the protein, or pre-digests it if you will, meaning you're able to absorb and utilize the amino acids it contains much faster. Now, under normal circumstances, you don't really need a fast supply of amino acids. Just eat some steak and the amino acids will gradually be released. Using protein powder during your daily routine offers no real benefits other than being cheap and convenient, which is still a plus. However, there is one period in the day of particular interest. That's right, it's the post-workout. Whether you're playing sports, hitting the weights, or just working on your cardio, anything that causes minor muscle damage, typically tied to healthy exercise. After these moments, your body is thrown into a highly anabolic state by a dramatic rise in muscle protein synthesis. This is the process that repairs muscle. In this state, your body craves more amino acids to rebuild. It's like a bunch of construction workers all hyped up on Red Bull and ready to work. The only thing they need is bricks to build, and those bricks are amino acids. Now, you don't have to eat protein powder, as your body will have pools of amino acids it can pull from. These are the leftovers from previous meals that are just waiting to be used. In addition, you could even just eat whole foods to provide protein. However, as mentioned, this must be digested before the muscles can access the amino acids. And it's here we find why we specifically take protein powder after training. Taking a protein powder that is already processed and broken down floods your bloodstream with amino acids. At the same time, it also causes an increase in muscle protein synthesis. It's a cheap and convenient method that makes it incredibly easy to create an optimum environment for building muscle. So, how does this work? Well, that's what we want to find out. One of the main reasons lifters take protein powder is for muscle growth. So, does protein powder actually drive more gains? Spoiler alert, yes, it does. A meta-analysis from 2012 examined studies with over 600 participants to determine if protein supplementation increased muscle mass. To be clear, this study specifically looked at the intake of protein powder post-workout. In addition, it only examined studies that were at least 6 weeks long, as it's believed protein supplementation benefits come from long-term use. You can't just chug protein shakes once and be summer body ready. After a full analysis, they made a pretty big find. When compared to placebos, protein supplementation resulted in a 38% greater increase in fat-free mass. So, if you gained 10 pounds of muscle without protein supplementation, you could have gained an extra 3.6 pounds with it. Right here, it's important to note that, as you can see, you can still increase muscle mass without protein supplementation. However, it will just capitalize on the hard work you put in the gym. So why settle for 10 pounds when you could have 13.8 just by drinking a tasty, cheap shake? Sounds like a no-brainer to us. A more recent meta-analysis was then performed in 2017, which examined a total of 1,863 participants. This makes it one of the largest meta-analyses to date, almost as large as you'll be if you keep chasing those gains. Again, when comparing protein supplementation with resistance training alone, the supplementation produced better results. This included a 27% increase in fat-free mass, as well as a 14% increase in muscle fiber cross-section area when compared to the placebo. One interesting note made in this meta-analysis was that protein supplementation was more effective for resistance-trained individuals. Why could this be the case? We suspect it's because it's easier for non-trained individuals to build muscle. When an untrained person starts training, gaining muscle is relatively easy. There's a lot more wiggle room with diet and training to see positive results in muscle growth. However, as you become more advanced, putting on muscle becomes increasingly difficult. We want to note this doesn't mean that untrained individuals did not see increases in muscle mass. They do. What that means is they saw similar results whether they consumed a protein supplement or not. Now that's two huge meta-analyses that both confirm that protein powder supplementation results in an increase in muscle mass. This is the general consensus since studies began on protein supplementation. For example, this study way back from 2005. In it, 22 young healthy men partook in resistance training methods for 14 weeks. When examining all the variables, everything was similar. One real difference was their post-workout meal. The control group simply ate a serving of carbohydrates, while the experimental group consumed a supplement containing 25 grams of protein, 16.6 grams from whey, and the remaining from other sources. After 14 weeks, the protein group did see a small advantage in strength with the squat jump. In the squat jump, an athlete descends into a semi-squat position and holds the position for approximately 3 seconds before takeoff. Here, the protein group saw a 9% improvement in height, whereas the carb group saw none. However, in the counter-movement vertical jump, there was no difference as both groups saw an increase of 10%. The counter-movement vertical jump is performed when the athlete starts from a standing position and initiates a downward movement, which is immediately followed by an upward movement leading to takeoff. Now, in terms of muscle hypertrophy, the protein group really outshined the carbohydrate group and saw significantly greater growth. Specifically, the protein group saw an 18% greater increase in type 1 fibers. These are smaller fibers that have less force capability, yet possess awesome endurance capability. In addition, they saw a 26% increase in the cross-section area of the muscle. 26%! The growth in the carb group was just negligible. Now let's go back to the increase in squat jumps. What's going on here? Why would the protein supplementation group see a larger squat jump than the placebo? Well, one of the reasons for the increase in the squat jump was thought to have occurred due to the increase in type 2 muscle fibers. Remember, these are the fibers that are responsible for creating a high amount of force. To look at the association between strength gains and muscle gains more, let's revisit the 2012 meta-analysis from earlier in the video. Remember, it reviewed 22 trials with protein's effect on muscle mass. However, it also examined gains in strength and concluded that the protein supplementation does in fact contribute to gains in strength, specifically 1 rep max strength, or the maximum amount of weight you can lift at one time. Now let's dig into the muscle hypertrophy results a little deeper. The results specifically showed a 45% larger increase in type 1 muscle fibers and a 55% larger increase in type 2 fibers. This increase was then related to the increase in strength, where it was found that a greater increase in muscle fiber CSA was accompanied by a 20% greater increase in 1 rep max leg press strength. Basically, the muscles with a larger increase in type 2 muscle fibers saw greater improvements in strength. To briefly explain this, an increase in muscle size and muscle strength are related but can occur from completely different mechanisms. Strength occurs through the improvement of the neuromuscular system, while the increased muscle mass occurs through the addition of contractile units of the muscle. This means that strength can increase independently from muscle growth. The existing muscle learns to produce more force. At the same time, when a muscle grows, it adds contractile units, which means the potential for strength goes up as well. So strength can go up through improvements in the neuromuscular system as well as the addition of contractile units. Therefore, strength and size will grow together, but it's not always a one-to-one increase. However, the muscle growth that occurred from the protein supplementation in the study also enabled the muscle to create more strength than if no muscle growth had occurred. Lucky for us, we can also turn to the other, more recent meta-analysis for more evidence of the effect of protein supplementation on strength. The studies in this meta-analysis utilized a variety of 1 rep max testing, such as bench press, arm curl, squat, and lat pull-down. Together, participants saw an average of a 9% increase in 1 rep max strength. However, as noted in the study, a 9% increase is pretty cool, but it's not a magic bullet. Your programming and exercise selection will likely have a much greater effect on strength gains. At that same time, we'll take the 9% increase if all we need to do is drink a thick, delicious ice cream cake batter protein shake. But perhaps the clearest illustration of protein supplementation benefiting an athlete is with pre-sleep protein. Pre-sleep protein is a relatively new area of study that examines the usefulness of drinking a protein supplement 30 minutes before sleep. Usually, this is done with casein protein, a slow-digesting protein. Unlike whey, which floods the bloodstream with amino acids quickly, casein releases a slower, steadier stream of amino acids. As a result, when taken before sleep, it increases the amount of amino acids in the bloodstream all night as you sleep, as well as muscle protein synthesis. This is effective at increasing muscle growth. While there's still a lot to learn about nighttime protein, the studies we have as of now are very promising. A meta-analysis from 2020 looked at all the studies to date and analyzed the results that a pre-sleep protein supplement had on muscle protein synthesis and other outcomes. It found that a 20 to 40 gram serving of casein protein increases muscle protein synthesis overnight. With that said, the general recommendation is on the larger end of that spectrum, 30 to 40 grams. That's great, but does this transfer to actual muscle growth? Well, pre-sleep protein was found to have positive benefits on 1 rep max strength, muscle size, and an increase in the cross-sectional area of muscle fibers. What makes this benefit specific to protein powder is that protein powder allows you to eat a large amount of protein quickly and with low calories. To reach that same amount of protein and calories with whole food, you need to eat 2 whole skinless chicken breasts with no seasoning or sauce. Yummy! Give me the cookies and cream protein shake, please. To our knowledge, there's been no study that's looked at whole food pre-sleep, but we imagine it's just not practical to do it on a consistent basis. And this is really the main benefit of protein powder. At certain times, having a quick, convenient protein source that actually tastes good is a very nice tool to have. In fact, this was the consensus of one of, if not the only study we know of that looked at using strictly whole foods for protein intake, including post-exercise. Yes, you can definitely only eat whole foods, however, it is difficult. The research concluded, however, obtaining dietary protein exclusively from whole foods may not always be convenient or feasible due to a variety of reasons including cost, palatability, competitive or training schedule, and volume of whole food that needs to be consumed to meet protein requirement. Protein supplements remain a convenient complementary nutritional strategy for physically active adults to meet protein recommendations at select meals throughout the day. And that should be your main takeaway. Protein powder is a cheap, convenient protein source that can be strategically used to optimize training outcomes and muscle growth. Taken at any other time of day, protein powder is really just another food source that makes reaching protein intake easy. So yes, protein powder works because it is just that, protein. So we've clearly shown that protein powder offers benefits, but what does that mean for you? Well, for one, it's important to point out that the meta-analyses specifically mentioned prolonged use. While there are some measurable outcomes that can occur overnight, meaningful adaptations take a long period of consistent use. Therefore, your nutritional strategy for protein should become a constant. In addition, consider your daily protein intake rather than just a single serving. The daily protein intake for athletes and lifters is much more than the general population's recommended daily intake due to the increased stress and damage placed on the muscle. Therefore, the general recommendation by leading sports researchers, such as the ISSN, is anywhere from 1.6 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. If you're in a caloric surplus, you can get away with the lower end. If you're losing weight with a caloric deficit, stick to the higher end. Not that you would, but you can probably guess this shouldn't all be eaten in one sitting. Studies have shown that spreading your protein throughout the day can optimize protein's role in the support and maintenance of your muscle mass. This is likely due to the spreading out of the spike in muscle protein synthesis from a single meal that lasts anywhere from 3 to 5 hours. Therefore, spread your total protein intake across 4 to 6 servings throughout the day, every 3 to 4 hours. The only thing to keep in mind here is that each serving should contain a minimum of 20 to 25 grams of protein. This tends to be the threshold for maximum spikes in MPS. What that means is that you can definitely consume more than this and will probably have to eat your total daily intake. However, that spike in muscle protein synthesis will not be as dramatic as it is up to the 25 grams when it starts to level off. Other than that, there are 2 occasions which merit special attention. First is your post-workout feeding. It used to be taught that you had 60 minutes post-workout to consume a meal. This was to capitalize on the spike of muscle protein synthesis from working out. We now know it isn't exactly true. As mentioned, the spike in MPS lasts much longer than 60 minutes. However, it does start to slowly decline. As long as you eat every 3 to 4 hours, you don't need to worry about it. However, we still advise to eat protein sooner rather than later, just like in the studies. At the same time, you might want to eat a larger amount of protein at this time. Before, we said that each serving should be at least 20 grams, as this is the threshold for maximal increases in MPS. However, after training, studies show that 40 grams can still cause a greater increase than 20 grams. Either way, it's a good strategy to make your post-workout meal your largest meal of the day. The second time is pre-sleep, which we just talked about. 30 to 40 grams of casein protein 30 minutes before you go to sleep, and you'll be good. Now, when it comes to protein powder, you can technically eat it for any of your protein feedings. Heck, you could eat it for all of your protein intake, but we wouldn't recommend that. You still want to get most of your protein from real food sources. This is to ensure the intake of other nutrients such as vitamins and minerals, as well as other compounds such as creatine, which comes from the meat. Don't fall into the trap of thinking the protein in powder is in any way superior to that in whole foods. It's literally the same thing. Again, we recommend post-workout and pre-sleep, perhaps as a snack or part of a breakfast smoothie, and you're good to go. And most importantly of all, remember that protein powder is a supplement. Just like all other supplements, it should supplement your diet. It shouldn't be 80% of your focus. Rather, the majority of your focus should be on eating whole foods and hitting your calories and macros. If you do that, 95% of the work is done. Then your focus on supplements, such as how to use protein powder, could give you the little bump in your performance you're looking for. Why do we use different exercises to train the same muscle? It's a common question in the gym. If one exercise trains a muscle, then what's the point of doing more exercises to train the same muscle? Why not make things simple and just do 20 sets of bench press and call it a day? The short answer is that doing more exercises will maximize your results. There's no doubt about it. And the real question we should be asking is how many different exercises should we use? So we're going to try to attempt to find out how many and why. If you've been to the gym for any length of time, you've probably noticed that a typical workout program consists of roughly anywhere between 5 and 9 different exercises. This seems to be the standard across the board, so our big question is why? More specifically, is this a good amount of exercises, or should there be more? Or perhaps even less? There are actually a few things to consider before answering this question, the first being how much work can be placed on a muscle. Since one of the most important variables in the process of muscle growth is the muscle's ability to recover for the next training session. When we go to the gym, we're essentially breaking down a muscle. Lifting weights causes stress and inflammation, which will trigger an anabolic response or the rebuilding phase. When put together, this creates a cycle of continuously stressing a muscle followed by repair. In other words, stressing a muscle is an imperative part of growth, making it a good thing, provided you're able to recover from that stress, of course. A threshold exists, though, where too much stress can actually be a detriment as the muscle is unable to recover in a timely manner. So in order to know how many exercises we should do, we need to know where this threshold lies. On top of that, we need to find out what the benefit of training a muscle with various exercises even brings. Is there any point to using a bunch of exercises, or does it just make us feel good that we're doing something different? So let's first determine the maximum amount of stress a muscle can handle, and by handle, we mean its maximum recoverable volume. Volume is the total amount of work that we put on the muscle, generally measured in a week of training. This is sometimes calculated as the total amount of weight, which is found by multiplying the sets times reps times the load or weight. However, for the remainder of this video, we'll be speaking of set volume. This is the total amount of working sets you use to train a muscle. For example, let's say you're doing bench press and perform 2 warm-up sets followed by 3 working sets of 5 reps. The total set volume would be 3. Therefore, the maximum recoverable volume means the maximum amount of working sets we can use to train a muscle in a week that still allows it to recover. Fortunately, thanks to scientific studies, we have a pretty good idea of what this number is. One of the most clear studies was a review of literature done in 2022 by a team of researchers who looked at 7 studies which examined set volume and muscle hypertrophy. To simplify things, they put the trainees into groups: those who performed less than 12 working sets for a muscle every week, those that performed 12 to 20 working sets weekly for a muscle, and those that performed 20-plus working sets. They found that the 12 to 20 set group and the 20-plus set group produced significantly greater gains than those who did less than 12 sets. However, there was no significant difference between the 12 and 20 and the 20-plus set group. This means that after 20 sets, you'll likely start to see diminishing returns. Therefore, you should plan on performing 10 to 20 working sets to train each muscle. Awesome, so we do 20 sets of pull-ups. Well, no. It's probably pretty obvious, but you shouldn't use just one exercise for all your sets. We've all heard that variety is the spice of life, and as it turns out, variety is also the spice of your lifting life. Here's why. It has to do with the phenomenon seen to occur within the growth of a muscle. If you're like most people, you probably assume a muscle is a muscle and will grow when it's activated. Well, it doesn't, at least not homogeneously or in a uniform manner. We need to remember that a muscle is not a single solid piece of tissue, rather it's a collection of smaller fibers that are all bundled together in various formations and held tightly together, kind of like a rope. At that same time, the entirety of a muscle does not have the same exact endpoints, known as the origin and the insertion. The origin of a muscle is where it attaches to the bone that remains stationary, the non-moving part. The insertion is the part of the muscle that's attached to the bone that's actually pulling the limb. Since variations can occur within the same muscle, distinct regions of the muscle will exert varying forces and experience greater strain during different movements. For these reasons, researchers have discovered that the entirety of a muscle will actually not grow uniformly when worked with a single exercise. This non-uniform growth in the muscle actually manifests in a few different ways. One area where uneven growth occurs are in the different heads of the muscle. Remember before when we talked about the origin and the insertion of a muscle? Well, many muscles will have several different origins. The muscle bellies from these origins all then run down to the bone and eventually merge into one spot. A muscle belly is the fleshy contractile part of the muscle responsible for generating force. As they then travel to the bottom of the bone, they merge into one tendon for insertion. These heads are often of different length, width, and may even be composed of different size muscle fibers. Further, they may travel at different angles depending on their origin. For example, your biceps have 2 heads, a short head and a long head. Your triceps has 3 heads, medial, lateral, and long head, while your quadriceps have 4 heads. While all these muscles will contract to perform a primary movement, each head will have a slightly different special job. For example, the posterior deltoid performs shoulder extension, or bringing the arm backward, while the anterior deltoid flexes the shoulder, bringing the arm forward. However, along with the lateral deltoid, they'll all contract to drive the arm abduction along the frontal plane. In addition, these muscles are activated differently depending on the angle of force put on it. For example, this study found that 12 different variations of the bench press made by altering the grip and bench angle hit the three heads of the pectoralis major differently. That is, different combinations of the bench press placed more or less growth on the different heads. What this means in application is that if you were to only choose one combination, you may get amazing growth for one of the heads, while the others would fall back. Still, while many people are somewhat aware of the idea of training the different heads of a muscle, it gets a bit more complicated since it seems that just about every region of every head can experience difference in growth. There was a large review from 2000 that researched the growth in muscle fibers, and the entire review was dedicated to looking at non-uniformity of muscle growth. In it, they looked at a study from 1996 that used 6 months to train the quadriceps with knee extensions. After that 6 months, the researchers found significant differences in growth of the four heads. When measuring the cross-sectional area of the quadriceps as a whole, the researchers found that the proximal region, those closest to the body, and the distal regions, those parts furthest from the body, increased by 19%, while the central region only increased by 13%. They also found that the vastus lateralis and the rectus femoris showed the greatest hypertrophy in the distal region, while the vastus intermedius and the medialis muscles showed greater hypertrophy in the proximal region. So basically, different regions of the four heads all saw different amounts of growth, and in fact, the review mentions that even single muscle fibers grow differently. Luckily, there have been studies that look at the results of using multiple exercises versus single exercises in a training program on muscle growth, such as a 2014 study where the researchers wanted to see what happens if you use just one exercise or multiple exercises to train the quads. The single exercises consisted of the squat, while the multiple exercise group trained the squat, leg press, deadlift, and lunge. The results were quite interesting. They found that both groups produced similar growth in the cross-section area of the quads. However, there's always nuance. When measuring the growth of the four heads of the quadriceps, they all saw even growth with the 4 exercises. On the other hand, the squat-only group only saw significant growth in the vastus lateralis and the vastus intermedius, while the rector femoris and the vastus medialis did not exhibit substantial increases in growth. That's to say, using multiple exercises produced more uniform growth, while a single exercise resulted in lopsided growth. In theory, this would result in greater overall muscle growth over time, as well as better aesthetics. The review concludes saying it would be advisable for bodybuilders to engage in different exercises to induce hypertrophy of different regions of a muscle, and that using multiple exercises to train a muscle should be an integral part of a training program. The problem is it doesn't make suggestions on how many. It seems it would make sense to use a separate exercise to specifically hit each head of every muscle. However, we only have a fixed amount of sets. Should we do 20 different exercises with only 1 set each, or is doing 5 different exercises with 4 sets better? Actually, again, we have a pretty good answer. Back in 2010, a meta-analysis was performed that compared the effects of a single set and multiple sets on muscle hypertrophy. The entire meta-analysis reviewed 8 studies to assess if any dose response existed with increased working sets. While they found that there was a positive trend toward more sets per exercise, no significant difference was found between 2 to 3 sets per exercise and 4 to 6 sets per exercise. And this was true for both trained and untrained individuals. One thing should be noted though, during the time of the study, there was a limited number of other studies that used 4 to 6 sets per exercise. Therefore, while there was a small positive trend associated with 4 to 6 sets, there simply weren't enough studies to become statistically significant. At that same time, a study from 2017 looked at the same question but specifically with upper body exercises. In it, they concluded that high sets of 3 or more aren't significantly better than 1 to 2 sets in untrained men. And in trained men, there are insufficient studies to make a conclusion. Therefore, it seems that when training a muscle for hypertrophy, 2 to 3 sets is probably sufficient, while 4 may have additional benefits. But we know that variation does, so stick to the 2 to 3 sets. And while we're talking about the number of exercises, we also need to acknowledge another very important factor: exercise selection. The exercises you choose are just as important as the number of exercises, possibly even more important. So let's examine the functionality of different exercises by looking at the biomechanics involved. Many of our different muscles actually cross not just one joint but 2. This means flexing 2 joints can work the same muscle, but with entirely different biomechanics. For example, hamstrings cross the knee joint and the hip joint on the posterior section, while the quadriceps cross the knee and the hips on the anterior. In addition, both the triceps and the biceps cross the elbow and shoulder joint. To ensure you maximally hit each muscle, you need to be sure to hit it with exercises that mimic its function. So in order to fully hit the hamstrings, you need to use an exercise that utilizes knee flexion, such as leg curls. However, as the hamstring crosses the hips, you also need to use a hip hinge movement, such as Romanian deadlifts. Now let's look at the biceps in more detail. Have you ever realized that when you do a curl, your elbow tends to come forward? This is because the long head actually crosses the shoulder joint and assists in elbow flexion when the arm lifts up in front of the body. This is what makes the Bayesian curl a favorite exercise for smart lifters. The Bayesian curl has you perform a single arm cable curl while looking away from the weight, which pulls your arm back. When you perform the curl, you drag your elbow forward with shoulder flexion while doing the curl. Other exercises could also include incline curls. Let's use the brachialis as another example. If you want bigger arms, it's vital you train the brachialis as it runs underneath the belly of the biceps muscle. Even though you can't see it, growing it will still require more space in the arm, causing it to expand. So, how do we train it? Well, let's look at its anatomy and its function. When looking at the function of the biceps, it's responsible for supination of the forearm and flexing of the elbow, but only in a supinated position, that is, palms up. In contrast, the brachialis has only one job to do: flex the elbow, and this occurs in every position. Knowing this, we know that the best way to enlarge this muscle is by using a neutral grip, such as a hammer curl, or a pronated grip that's palms down, such as a reverse curl. This mitigates the biceps and puts the majority of the stress on the brachialis. Again, the point is that exercise selection is just as important as the number of exercises we use to train the muscle, if not more. Using 3 strategically selected exercises will be better than 4 or 5 random ones. Also realize that every exercise doesn't need to be a completely new exercise. Rather, you can simply make alterations to the movement. For example, using different grips like we saw in the chest study, as well as the discussion on the biceps and the brachialis. Also, putting the body at different angles will alter muscle activation. For example, many leg press machines have a backrest that allows you to adjust the angle. Sitting with the backrest more upright, similar to sitting in a chair, will cause greater flexion in your hips. This greater amount of hip flexion will require more involvement of the hamstrings muscle. On the other hand, leaning back more creates less flexion in the hips. This will decrease the involvement of the hamstrings and place a greater percentage of force on the quadriceps, as knee extension will become the more dominant movement. Even different foot placement can cause differences in activation. And again, remember the bench press study. The main point is you don't necessarily need a completely different exercise in your repertoire. You just need to make the correct alterations. Okay, so how do we apply everything we learned from these studies to our real life? The problem is that even with what we know, there's no clear-cut guide that tells us how many exercises we need to perform. But we can use all the information to make an educated guess. Let's first remember that a muscle should be hit with 10 to 20 sets per week. Now let's assume you train your muscle twice a week. Multiple studies have found twice a week to be the optimal training frequency, which you should train a muscle. That means that the muscle should be hit with 5 to 10 sets per session. We also know that each exercise should use 2 to 3 sets per exercise. This seems to be where the threshold for hypertrophy lies, since as you recall, once you start doing more, you start to see diminishing returns. While we could maybe use more sets, remember that variety is the key as far as hypertrophy is concerned. By sticking to smaller numbers of sets, we can utilize more exercises, aka more variety. So with that said, use 3 sets for your bigger primary exercises, while your smaller exercises could use 2. Therefore, you could train your large muscle groups with 2 to 4 exercises per session, 2 times a week. Keep in mind, the number of days a week you train can dictate this. Training 5 days versus 3 days gives you significantly more time. If you're trying to fulfill maximal sets per muscle group, you probably want to train 5 days a week, and we'll show you an example of a great program to use in just a moment. But first, one point to remember: while you can use 2 exercises that are biomechanically similar, they should be trained in different sessions. For example, let's say you're training your back. You could perform bent over rows in one session and the T-bar row or bent over row with an underhanded grip in the second. Now when it comes to your smaller muscles, specifically the biceps and triceps, there's a little more nuance. Keep in mind that your arms are trained during every single upper body compound movement. For example, the biceps are hit during pull-ups, while the triceps are hit with bench press. Therefore, they would only likely need an extra 10 sets of isolation work a week. That's max. This would equate to about 1 to 2 exercises a session. Again, that's a maximum. Further, your shoulders get hit a lot with every pushing and pulling exercise. Every type of horizontal movement trains the front deltoid, while every pulling exercise trains the rear deltoid. Therefore, they wouldn't need 3 to 4 shoulder-specific movements. They can also be good with around 10 specific sets a week. All in all, if we were to take everything into consideration, with a 5-day split, it would look something like this. Session 1, which targets the chest and back and consists of bench press, 3 sets of 5 reps or a 3x5, chin-ups 3x5, chest dips 3x8, T-bar row 3x8, barbell shrugs 3x10, cable fly 2x12, reverse fly 2x12, and face pull 2x12. Session 2 is all about the lower, so you'll do deadlift at a 3x5, front squat 3 sets of 6 reps, barbell good morning 3x8, machine hack squat 3x8, lying hamstring curl 2x12, leg extension 2 sets of 12 reps, calf raise 2x12, and finish with some core work. Session 3 hits the shoulders, chest, and arms. Military press 3 sets of 6 reps, incline dumbbell bench press 3x6, Arnold press 3x8, dumbbell pullover 3 sets of 10 reps, decline cable fly 2x10, rope upright row 2x10, hammer curl 2x12, overhead triceps extension with a rope 2x12. Session 4 is lower again, but with different exercises. So we have the back squat with 3 sets of 5 reps, Romanian deadlift with 3x5, split squat 3x8, hip thrust 3x8, leg extension 2x12, Nordic curl 2x5, standing calf raise 2x12, and some core work. And then session 5 is back, shoulders, and arms. Rack pull 3 sets of 5 reps, seated dumbbell overhead press 3x8, dumbbell row 3x8, lat pull down 3x8, lateral raises 2x10, face pull 2x10, easy curl 2x12, and triceps push down 2x12. There's one more factor to consider. You can swap out your exercises, or that's to say you should swap out your exercises. Swapping out your exercises gives you the ability to provide even more stimuli to your body to challenge it while also keeping things interesting. However, you don't want to swap out too often, as it will not allow you to properly apply progressive overload. Progressive overload is the idea that in order to see continuous muscle adaptations, such as size or strength, one must continually place a greater demand on the muscle over time. Therefore, swapping exercises weekly does not allow a lifter to improve upon their lift, as they're always changing what they do. Rather, you want enough time to become accustomed to the exercise and then improve upon it. Once you train the exercise for some time, your progress will begin to slow, and then you can swap. Unfortunately, there's no hard number for this, but generally a time period of 4 to 8 weeks is given. We would advise to use the longer period of 6 to 8 weeks for your larger compound exercises. On the other hand, your isolation exercises could be swapped every 4 weeks. Keep in mind, you can swap them all at once, or you could even just swap one per week. As we see, when it comes to exercises, there does seem to be some truth to more is better, at least in terms of variation. Therefore, your goal should be to utilize the largest variation of exercises within your ability to recover. Program them in a sensible manner so that you can apply progressive overload to them before any swapping. If you can do that, you'll have the optimal amount of exercises to maximize growth. Do you want to live longer, live with less disease, and have a better sense of self-worth? These are just a few of the benefits that are said to be the result of fasting. Yep, all that from simply not eating. Most people are only aware of its effect on fat loss and weight maintenance, which is also a must for a healthy lifestyle. Around the world, obesity has been steadily growing at an increasing rate. The CDC quotes a startling number of 41.9% for obesity prevalence in the USA. As such, everyone's trying different diets to lose weight, including fasting. In this video, we're going to look at exactly what happens to your body during a fast, including its amazing benefits. While weight loss is one, you probably aren't aware of the other one. Continue watching to find out. Before we talk about fasting, we need to define it. In its simplest definition, fasting is the abstention from eating, drinking liquids with calories, and sometimes drinking altogether. This simple definition would imply that we're always fasting so long as we're not eating. This is pretty much all day. This doesn't really describe what fasting is. Therefore, some state that a period of fasting officially begins 3 to 5 hours after your meal, as that's how long it takes for your last meal to be fully digested and absorbed. Still, even with this definition, we fast every day. Well, at least an overnight fast. The first meal of the day is called breakfast or break fast. It's when our body comes out of this daily overnight fast with the first food of the day and breaks the fast. Still, others will say a fast begins when physiological changes begin to occur. From this perspective, a fast could be said to begin 12 hours after your last meal. This is when a metabolic shift takes place in most individuals. We'll talk more about that later on in the video. While the exact time a quote fast begins is up for discussion, we do know that refraining from eating has been around for a long time. Although fasting has hit the fitness community only recently, it's actually been a part of mankind's history since the beginning. When humans fasted originally, it was due to having no choice in the matter. Before humans developed agriculture and cultivated livestock, they practiced a foraging lifestyle and did not get to choose when they would eat their meals. In fact, fasting has been practiced in this manner for much of mankind's history, as agriculture has only been around for 12,000 years. Therefore, it's believed that many of the first post-agricultural communities practiced fasting as their bodies were already adapted to it, and continuous eating could have been seen as strange. For example, the early Romans believed that eating more than one large meal a day led to sickness. In addition, many of the early religions practiced fasting in some manner as a religious practice, often as a way to deny the body's physical needs in order to focus on its higher deity. This went on until the 1800s, when overeating was becoming recognized as an unhealthy lifestyle practice and possibly responsible for many diseases, a view particularly believed by an American physician, Edward Dewey, who believed every disease was caused by overeating. In the 1900s, German physician Otto Buchinger became the first to study and note the health benefits of fasting, saying, "Fasting is, without any doubt, the most effective biological method of treatment." In the 2000s, the Italian biogerontologist and fasting researcher Walter Longo noted that fasting has numerous significant benefits that lead to both an extended lifespan and an extended health span. Even with these proponents and a growing base of supporting research that testifies to the health benefits of fasting, it can still be looked at with uncertainty by the public. This is primarily because many people simply don't understand what actually happens during fasting, except you get hungry. Still, even what is largely misunderstood as hunger is not reported nearly as much as you might think. This lack of hunger is just one of the things we'll look into in this video as we look at what's going on physiologically during a 3-day fast. Let's get into what happens when you put the fork and knife down. After you eat your meal, your food is broken down, including your carbohydrates, which initially causes a spike in your blood glucose levels. Initially, these blood glucose levels are what's used to supply energy and maintain function. However, as time progresses longer and longer after you eat, your blood glucose levels will begin to drop. In order to maintain functional blood glucose levels, glycogen, which is basically a stored version of glucose, will begin to break down. This is done through a process known as glycogenolysis in order to supply extra glucose during times of fasting. As you go farther, your glycogen levels will begin to drop lower and lower. This will force your body to turn to non-carbohydrate sources, namely fats and proteins, to convert to glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. Then your body will turn to ketosis, the production of ketones for energy. We'll look at this process in greater detail below. But rather than rely on glucose, your body will then use these ketones for energy. In addition, this will spare the glucose that's produced to fuel red blood cells and the brain, which require glucose to function. Regardless, this whole process provides a very important benefit: the lowering and stabilization of blood glucose levels and the increase of sensitivity to insulin. With over 10% of the U.S. population suffering from diabetes, fasting could make a massive impact on the country's health. Small studies on patients with diabetes have even shown that fasting can be effective for weight loss in those with type 2 diabetes while decreasing the need for insulin. Now, the same process that results in the stabilization of blood glucose and sensitivity to insulin also has another profound effect. In fact, from a fitness and performance perspective, this may be the most profound effect of fasting: a metabolic shift in the production of energy. We just went through the basics of this process but only touched on the stabilization of glucose. Now we'll go through it again in detail in terms of its effect on the metabolism of energy. With the rise in keto, many people in the fitness industry are familiar with the concept of becoming fat-adapted, or your body utilizing fatty-free acids for energy. But what does this mean? Well, the term fat-adapted can be a bit of a misnomer, as many may take this to mean your body doesn't usually use fat. It does, but it uses carbohydrates as its preferred source of glucose production under normal eating conditions. As carbohydrates are essentially just strands of sugars, breaking them down is a relatively simple process. They'll be broken down into glucose and sent directly to the bloodstream, or glycogen to be stored for later use. However, as mentioned before, your body can also convert fat or protein into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis, the synthesis of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. As you could guess, this is a much more complicated process, as it must completely transform compounds. Therefore, under normal eating conditions, your body has two sources to produce glucose: carbs in the form of stored glycogen, or fatty acids from stored fat. Under normal conditions, your body will use both of these sources for fuel. What's different is the varying degrees it'll rely on one or the other. Depending on individual factors and activity levels, under normal conditions, your body may get 50 to 70% of its energy requirements from carbs, while getting 30 to 50% of its energy requirements from fat. However, as your fasting time lengthens, your stored glycogen will begin to be converted into glucose more and more. The problem with this is that there is a finite supply of glycogen. Therefore, as the fast continues, your levels of glycogen will drop lower and lower, as you aren't replenishing it with food. As this occurs, your body will start to alter the ratio of where it gets its glucose from. In order to spare glycogen, your body will begin to break down fat to a greater extent. However, as of now, keep in mind that the fat must still be converted into glucose to utilize. This greater reliance on fats for the production of glucose is what occurs during the initial stages of fasting. The length of time for this stage can vary depending on the original baseline glycogen levels as well as your activity levels. As a result, it can last anywhere from 12 to 36 hours. First-time fasters generally take longer to pass through this first stage, while experienced fasters tend to take a shorter time in this phase. Now, as you continue with your fast, the levels of glycogen within the body are heavily depleted. At this time, fatty acids and glycerol are then produced in an accelerated fashion and sent into the bloodstream to head for the liver. It's at the liver where they produce compounds known as ketones. Remember them? These ketones are unique, as they're also able to act as an alternative source of energy. To be clear, they are not converted into glucose first. Rather, these ketones are sent to tissue to be used directly. It's at this moment when you've become fat adapted. Your body has transitioned from utilizing glucose for energy to ketones for energy. As you could have guessed, this is where the keto diet comes from, except they reach this metabolic shift merely by limiting carb consumption to a minimum. The point is that this metabolic shift is a significant change to the body's physiological system, and it's truly a testament to how magnificent the human body is. Another magnificent adaptation to fasting is a process known as autophagy. Autophagy is your body's waste and renewal system. It's a process by which cells break down so that damaged or dysfunctional components can be removed. These are then replaced with healthy components to maintain a fully functional cell and maintain homeostasis. The process of autophagy can be triggered by a number of different factors, fasting being one of them. During fasting, insulin levels drop, and the body starts to use stored energy such as glycogen and fat for fuel. This shift in energy metabolism may activate autophagy to recycle cellular components and generate the amino acids and fatty acids needed for energy production. Now, where this becomes especially important is with an increase in longevity. Fasting or prolonged calorie restriction has long been associated with an increase in life. As autophagy gets rid of sick cells and replaces them with healthy cells, it makes sense that these individuals with a higher rate of autophagy will have longer lives with less disease as well. In fact, researchers now believe that the autophagy triggered by fasting is primarily responsible for its effect on longevity. Upon fasting, increases in rates of autophagy have been found in just about every organ and tissue, including the heart, liver, kidneys, and muscles. Still, autophagy has been found to work on neurons, which acts as a key mechanism for the prevention of malignancy, infection, and neurodegenerative diseases, as well as in slowing aging. The exact amount of time needed to trigger autophagy is unclear. For example, some studies suggest that merely breaking down your total calories into 2 meals a day is enough. To be clear, if you eat 3,000 calories a day, you would eat 2 meals of 1,500 calories. Other research has shown that simple intermittent fasting is enough to offer positive benefits to cancer patients. So while we don't know the exact time frame and mechanisms, we can be pretty confident telling you that 3 days is more than enough time. So now let's move on to a more obvious adaptation. If you're not eating, you gotta lose weight, right? You do. In fact, apart from religious or political reasons, weight loss, or the maintenance of weight, is one of the more common reasons someone might partake in a regular fast. Researchers have discovered that during the initial phases of a fast, there's a rapid loss of weight. In fact, the weight loss is significantly higher than one would expect just from comparing calories burned versus calories consumed. For example, a case study followed a man who ran a 36-day fast while attempting a 40-day fast for religious purposes. During the fasting period, he only consumed a total of 60 calories a day for communion and only drank water. With a starting weight of 68.6 kilograms, he lost a total of 15.7 kilograms during the fast. However, the drop in weight did not occur evenly. During the first 5 days, he lost an average of 0.9 kilograms a day. This then gradually dropped for the next until it evened out at 0.3 kilograms a day. What's interesting is that 0.9 kilograms would require a caloric deficit of 3,150 calories. However, his basal energy expenditure was only 1,673 calories. These are the calories your body burns to support life functions such as thinking and respiratory function. While the man wasn't bedbound, he didn't even come close to burning 1,500 extra calories. So what happened? Well, it's established that this rapid drop is due to the result of salt and water diuresis. Further, a drop in total muscle glycogen will likely also play a role as well. It's important to keep this in mind as you may drop 3 kilos in 3 days. However, maybe only half of that is actually body weight, while the rest will be gained back by eating. Losing weight is obviously a big plus for many people. Still, there's a more curious adaptation going on behind the scenes. Well, actually, in your head. Fasting has just as much effect on the physical as it does the mental side. One of the more unique aspects of prolonged fasting is an increase in not only satiety, but well-being as well. This sense of euphoria is what has led some to attach fasting to a spiritual aspect. Regardless, it is widely reported, very widely. Reports have estimated that 93.2% of participants in prolonged fasting report an increase in physical and emotional well-being, as well as an absence of hunger feelings. The researchers report that an absence of hunger often shocked the individuals, as fear of hunger is often a deterring factor to fasting. One large study monitored a group of individuals who partook in a fasting protocol for 4 to 21 days. During their individual fasting periods, all the participants saw a gradual increase in emotional well-being and personal well-being until the end of their fast. What's interesting is that those who started with a lower baseline tended to choose to fast for longer periods. Regardless, at the end of their session, all protocols resulted in the same level of increased well-being. This increase in well-being has a variety of mechanisms that are thought to play a role. For example, fasting seems to cause the production of endogenous opioids. In addition, the glucose to keto switch also leads to cognition, mood, motor, and autonomic nervous system function, which increases well-being. It also increases the production of a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. BDNF plays many roles and is often associated with neurogenesis and neuronal protection. Further, it's been shown to enhance the growth and survival of serotonin neurons. Speaking of BDNF, it plays yet another role in fasting. Anecdotally, a very common report after prolonged fasting is clearer thinking or sharper thought process results. We now have a better understanding as to why. A fact of life is that as we age, our bodies deteriorate, including our brains. This process can lead one to develop a number of neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, or general dementia. Aging of the brain can also lead to a greater chance of experiencing a stroke. Unfortunately, research has now shown that this process can be exacerbated by living a sedentary lifestyle as well as consistently eating a surplus of calories. However, we now also know several ways to combat this deterioration, such as being involved in exercise throughout your life. In addition, challenging the body metabolically has also been found to maintain healthy brain function. One of these mechanisms is through the production of proteins, bringing about metabolic challenges that are involved in synaptic plasticity, neurogenesis, neuronal survival, memory, and learning. Of all of these proteins, the one we just spoke about is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. As we age, this protein sees a steady loss in sedentary persons, which is coupled with a degradation of cognitive performance. Research has shown that its decrease is accompanied by a reduction in synaptic plasticity, memory, and learning, as well as an increased risk of cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. And this is where fasting comes into play. Various fasting methods, such as intermittent fasting, have been found to upregulate BDNF and improve cognitive performance. Yet another positive effect fasting has on brain health is through the gut biome. Research has shown that IF changes the composition of the gut microbiota to favor brain health. While these benefits to the brain are awesome, you aren't going to reap the benefits from one 3-day fast. Rather, you should run 3-day fasts periodically. We should also mention that fasting has the ability to both prevent neurodegenerative diseases and the onset of dementia, as well as treat these impairments. As such, if you have a fully healthy brain, you may not see or feel benefits as you already are at your threshold for a healthy brain. However, just because you may not notice improvements, you can rest assured that fasting will keep your brain healthy. With that said, when it comes to acute effects, some studies showed there might be a slight decrease in cognition tasks such as reaction. This seems to occur after 24 hours, but may only be present during the transition period. At the same time, studies are inconclusive, so the exact causes are unknown, but the level of experience likely plays a role. While your brain is benefiting from fasting, we're now going to look at its effect on your endocrine system. Human growth hormone, or HGH, is a powerful peptide hormone that plays a crucial role in growth, development, and overall metabolic function. Due to its vast array of functions, it works through several mechanisms. During fasting, HGH promotes the breakdown of fat, lipolysis, and the release of fatty acids for energy. As this is a primary mechanism of fasting, it stands to reason that human growth hormone will increase during a 3-day fast. Actually, it doesn't even need 3 days. Studies have found that HGH can increase in just 2 days of fasting. Now, you could be thinking, but what about the potential adverse effects? Does it pose any harm to individuals? The truth is, it does happen, but perhaps not as much as you might expect. For example, one study looked at over 1,300 persons who followed what's known as the Buchinger-Wilhelmi fast. It's a fasting protocol that only allows 150 to 200 calories per day. During this period, there were fortunately no deaths or permanent effects. However, there were 2 hospitalizations: an elderly man with coronary artery disease who had a myocardial infarction, and a 67-year-old woman who experienced vomiting, diarrhea, and dizziness. Other than that, the most common disorders were sleep disturbances, seen by 14.94% of patients, fatigue by 13.7%, dry mouth by 8.84%, back pain by 7.43%, and hunger affecting 6.81%. In total, there were 22 mild symptoms and 8 different serious side effects. So, as you might imagine, fasting does carry some potential adverse effects, so it's not something to take lightly. However, with some preparation and planning, the risk of a serious event is quite small. Although we went through quite a few major physiological changes and adaptations in this video, it's still not all of them. Energy metabolism is one of the most important processes in the human body, and by fasting, you're creating an entirely new environment that forces your body to alter it completely. That's going to have a profound effect. It's probably safe to say that fasting will have an effect to some magnitude on just about every system. For example, we also have research to show that fasting has positive effects on the immune system as well as your cardiorespiratory system. As more and more research is done, it'll give researchers the ability to discover even more benefits. So now that you know what's going to happen to your body after not eating for 3 days, do you want to give it a shot? Now slow down there for a second. Going 72 hours without eating is not something to take lightly. If you've never fasted before, the longest you've probably ever gone without eating is 12 hours. Maybe 24 on accident one time. That would mean 72 hours is 3 to 6 times longer. Even though studies have shown that doing prolonged fasts is relatively safe, they do bring some health risks, as we saw. Therefore, think about it as lifting weights. Even though lifting is relatively safe, you don't just jump on your first day with a 5-hour session, including huge 1-rep max tests on all your barbell lifts. Rather, you ease into it. Therefore, before you do a 72-hour fast, begin with a shorter duration. The easiest option is intermittent fasting, or IF. IF is a method of fasting that alternates short blocks of time for feeding and long blocks of fasting. For example, you could start with an 8-hour block where you're allowed to consume food, followed by a 16-hour block of time for fasting. You could then gradually lengthen the block of fasting until you're left with just 1 meal a day, or OMAD. From there, you can move on to a full 24-hour fast, and so on. Another tip to prepare for longer fasts is to consume calories, but only in liquid form. This can help adapt to the sensation of not eating. In addition, you can practice by consuming a minimal amount of calories. For example, for your first 3-day fast, consume just 1,000 calories per day. On your next one, consume 750 calories, and then so on. Slowly adjust to fasting for longer periods of time. As you can see, there are multiple methods you can use. If you choose to try fasting, we wish you success and only ask that you perform a fast that you're safely able to do. And let us know how it went. Have you ever seen this before? Guys with a literal timer on their watch set to go off every few hours to remind them to eat their protein? They do this to ensure that they never see the slightest little dip in muscle protein synthesis throughout the day. But with a big emphasis on the day part. Things change at night since there is this huge 8+ hour block of time that's been ignored in terms of protein intake. That is, until now. Recently, researchers have looked into this overlooked time frame and have made some pretty interesting discoveries, and now we have the answer to how you could actually grow more while you sleep with pre-sleep protein. Our muscle mass is in a perpetual state of tug-of-war between two processes that dictate if we gain or lose muscle mass: muscle protein synthesis, or MPS, and muscle protein breakdown. Muscle protein synthesis, or MPS, is the technical term for the process of building new muscle. While usually associated with building new muscle, it's always occurring to facilitate our protein turnover rate. Just like every other cell in the body, our muscle cells must renew themselves to stay healthy. This is one of the reasons why everyone needs to consume protein regardless of whether you work out 6 days a week or just watch Netflix every day. When we consume protein, it's digested and broken down into its individual amino acids. These amino acids have many jobs, but the most important is triggering MPS, causing a transitory spike. Amino acids are brought in to rebuild muscle, and voila, you have more muscles. Resistance training will also increase the rate of MPS by way of mechanical stress and the accumulation of metabolites. It's for this reason it's suggested to consume a post-workout meal full of protein and amino acids, as the body is in a more favorable condition for muscle growth. But whether it's from training or the consumption of protein, MPS is spiked, creating an anabolic environment that favors the growth of muscle. However, when our MPS levels drop, we're at a risk of losing muscle, especially if muscle protein breakdown increases. It's this struggle that's made the topic of food timing so popular, with the goal to maximize the amount of time our bodies have positive levels of MPS. In a nutshell, food timing refers to the practice of consuming your nutrition at specific times to enhance its beneficial effects. It can include numerous elements such as carb loading, but for this video we're only concerned with the timing of our protein ingestion. As mentioned, when you consume a protein-rich meal or a protein supplement, it's broken down and your bloodstream is flooded with amino acids, which creates a transitory spike. Depending on the protein source and the ingestion with other macronutrients, an MPS spike rises quickly and then gradually returns to baseline in 3 to 5 hours. As our goal is to have a consistent rise in MPS, we risk a drop by waiting too long between our feedings. Therefore, instead of eating all of our protein in one sitting, the most popular strategy of consuming protein is to spread it out equally throughout the day. The objective is to provide an overlap of the spikes from the individual protein feedings. While there's no consensus, this is the general strategy suggested by most sports researchers and institutions, such as the International Society of Sports Nutrition. Their stand on protein suggests the consumption of at least 20 to 25 grams of protein, around 0.25 grams per kilogram per meal with each main meal, with no more than 3 to 4 hours between meals. This would equal around 4 to 6 servings per day. For example, if you need to eat 150 grams of protein, you might eat 5 servings of 30 grams of protein spaced out every 3 hours. This allows you to generate a steady spike in MPS throughout the day. But what about the night? That's where the issue of sleep comes into play. If we're talking about a healthy individual who is active, they'll probably eat their last meal a couple of hours before sleep and then eat breakfast maybe 30 minutes after they wake up. Given that you should sleep for 8 hours, that's 10.5 hours you're not supplying your body any amino acids. Theoretically then, if eating every 3 to 4 hours maximizes MPS throughout the day, this would mean you're going 4 to 6 hours with low levels of MPS. Could this period of time that's been neglected so long actually contain a muscle hack? Sports researchers decided that someone should look into this vast amount of time that no one's been utilizing, and in 2012, one of the first studies on overnight protein consumption was conducted. 16 healthy men performed a resistance training session in the evening at 8 p.m. and were given a post-exercise meal of 20 grams of protein and 60 grams of carbs. After this, the 16 men were divided into two groups, one that drank a placebo 30 minutes before bed and one that drank 40 grams of casein protein. Their blood levels were sampled throughout the entirety of their sleep, which totaled 7.5 hours. What they found was that the protein group had elevated levels of amino acids circulating throughout the night. In addition, they had better whole-body protein synthesis and a greater net total of protein. This study did not look at any performance factors such as recovery or muscle hypertrophy, but it was the first study to show that overnight protein can be effectively digested and absorbed, resulting in greater bioavailability of amino acids, increased muscle protein synthesis, and greater net protein. A similar study was done in 2018 by the same group, this time with 36 healthy young men eating 30 grams of casein. Again, amino acids were found in greater concentration throughout the night. However, muscle protein synthesis wasn't increased to the same extent, suggesting that perhaps larger amounts like 40 grams used in the previous study were needed. Nevertheless, the results were still promising. Right now, you might be thinking, awesome, MPS is great, but what about actual muscle gains or recovery? That's a fair question, and pre-sleep protein delivers again. What may be the first study to actually demonstrate benefits to body composition and performance was conducted in 2015, and differing from the other studies that were short-term, this one was carried out for 3 months. In it, 44 young men were all placed on a resistance training program for 12 weeks. Every variable was the same except for one group that consumed a protein supplement that consisted of 27.5 grams of protein and 50 grams of carbohydrate immediately before sleep, and the other just a placebo. After 3 months of resistance training, both groups saw significant gains in strength, muscle mass, and an increase in muscle fiber size. However, the pre-sleep protein group saw the increases in composition and strength we're looking for. The cross-section area of the quadriceps of the placebo group saw an increase of 6%, while the protein group saw an increase of 10%. In addition, the protein group also saw a significant increase in type 2 muscle fibers. Type 2 muscle fibers are those responsible for generating high amounts of force for a short amount of time, as seen in weightlifting and sprints. Strength-wise, the protein group experienced greater results in strength across a multitude of exercises, including leg press, row, and overhead shoulder press. Yet another study from 2021 found that pre-sleep protein resulted in significantly greater perceived recovery compared to that of a placebo after resistance training. Many of the variables were similar to the study we just looked at. They trained in the evening and had a protein supplement post-exercise, then had a serving of protein or placebo 30 minutes before sleep. Where this study is a bit unique is that it used both a casein supplement, a blended casein whey supplement, and a placebo. However, the blend used a 2-to-1 ratio of casein to whey. In the morning, both pre-sleep protein groups produced significantly better results in perceived soreness when compared to the placebo. And when compared to one another, the casein group slightly outperformed the blended group. Perceived recovery is definitely cool as no one likes pain, but can pre-sleep protein actually go past just how it makes us feel and actually improve performance? Yes, it can. While not lifting weights, professional soccer players see a large amount of muscle damage from their matches. In fact, it can be so intense they actually experience drops in performance for several days after a match. During this time, players often report losses in strength, power, and sprint performance, while also experiencing muscle soreness and discomfort. In 2018, a group of researchers decided to see if pre-sleep protein could possibly offer any benefits to those athletes. So 10 young soccer players were selected for a case study on 2 separate nights after matches. After playing an evening match, half of them consumed a protein supplement containing 40 grams of casein protein just before sleep, while the others acted as a control group. Upon waking, they were tested on several different outcomes to determine if their pre-sleep supplement could lead to greater performance. To figure out if there was a performance gain, a counter-movement jump height was one of the variables tested, which is a vertical jump test for height. An athlete will quickly drop to a self-selected depth and then jump as high as possible. Results show that the placebo group demonstrated a moderate deficit, while the protein group only demonstrated a small deficit. In terms of reactive strength, the placebo group was greatly affected until 60 hours post-exercise. The protein group only saw some trivial changes from the start. Both groups experienced muscle soreness, but the protein group reported much less at just the 12-hour mark. Now here's where it gets really interesting. In the soccer study, both groups consumed a post-exercise meal, and since in this case the exercise was an evening soccer match, they both had a nighttime feeding. So, shouldn't the control group have seen the benefits of nighttime protein? The difference was that the test group consumed their additional protein supplement 30 minutes before sleep. This suggests eating your protein a few hours before bed isn't enough. Instead, it seems that pre-sleep consumption less than 30 minutes before sleep is the key to providing excessively greater benefits throughout the night. So far, we've seen that pre-sleep protein can benefit both strength and team sport athletes. Now let's take a look at its effects on endurance athletes. In 2023, 36 healthy young men performed an hour of endurance exercises from 7:45 p.m. to 8:45 p.m. In addition, they ate an earlier dinner plus a post-exercise meal. They then waited until 30 minutes before sleep at 11:30 p.m. when they consumed one of 3 different supplements: 45 grams of casein, 45 grams of whey, or a placebo. They then went to bed as normal. In addition to the larger servings of protein, this study had its own unique twist. It specifically tested both mitochondrial and myofibrillar protein synthesis. Both of these involve synthesizing proteins, however they differ in exact function. Myofibrillar proteins are actual contractile components involved in strength. This includes myosin, actin, tropomyosin, and troponin. On the other hand, mitochondrial proteins are responsible for creating energy. The differences between them are best explained by the study itself, which says the synthesis of myofibrillar proteins is primarily responsible for changes in skeletal muscle mass following resistance training, while mitochondrial proteins are primarily synthesized in response to endurance-type training. With that in mind, the study found that both the whey and casein protein significantly increased the synthesis of both proteins. That's to say, pre-sleep protein can support the recovery from both strength and endurance-related events. This study also found no difference in the magnitude of protein synthesis in the casein compared to whey. Now, we do need to note that not every study shows positive results, such as one from 2022. In it, resistance-trained men performed a resistance training workout and then consumed either protein supplements or a placebo drink before sleep. The next day, they conducted another training session, but in this case, the pre-sleep group saw no differences in training performance when compared to the placebo group. Now, one possibility for this might have to do with the measurement. This study used 1-rep max testing for a bench press and squats to measure performance, which is basically where you lift as much weight as you can for 1 rep. By using 1-rep max testing, while some muscle damage may have occurred, it may not have been enough to cause an actual improvement upon these maximal heavy barbell movements, at least in a single session. In fact, a study from 2017 also measured the effect of pre-sleep protein on strength performance and found it did improve. However, this study tested repetitions to failure, counter-movement jump, and maximal voluntary contraction. This is in addition to the study we went over earlier that showed long-term use, 12 weeks of pre-sleep protein improved both recovery and muscle size. It would make sense that this long-term would be necessary to see measurable differences in larger exercises. The point we want to make clear is that there is still a lot to learn about pre-sleep protein ingestion. But still, in general, studies on pre-sleep protein ingestion does lean toward it being beneficial. As this meta-analysis summarizes, based on current evidence, the consumption of 20 to 40 grams of casein, approximately 30 minutes before sleep, improves protein synthetic response during an overnight recovery period in healthy young adult men, with possible positive effects on muscle mass and strength following prolonged resistance exercise. And at this point, we want to note that benefits seem to apply more to younger trainees as opposed to the older population. But we're not done yet. Chances are you might be thinking, won't eating at night make me fat? In short, no. And looking at the effect that nighttime eating has on the body is an entire video of its own. But first, you need to keep in mind that this extra protein at night is not an entire meal, it's a snack. As protein has 4 calories per gram, a 40-gram supplement will have 160 calories from protein. There's always more than just pure protein, so depending on the quality, it should still usually be under 200 calories. And new studies have found that low-calorie snacks, especially when they're protein-dense, will not have adverse effects in active populations. Concerning nighttime snacking, this 2015 study even hypothesized this about high-protein snacks. It's plausible to hypothesize that acute enhancements in overnight muscle protein synthesis and next morning resting metabolism may further aid in the maintenance and/or improvement in body composition. Well, newer studies have provided more evidence for this statement. For example, a 2022 study found that pre-sleep protein actually increased sleep energy expenditure and next-day fullness. And this result seems to be similar to most other studies on pre-sleep protein. Now, to be clear, we're not saying this is going to melt the fat off of you. In the grand scheme of things, the benefit will likely be quite small. Rather, the main point is it's not going to contribute to overeating, damaged metabolisms, or anything like that. So any fear that you have from scaremongering advice in the past, like don't eat dinner after 6 or you'll get fat, can be put to rest. It's simply not a real concern. You probably noticed that a lot of these studies are using something called casein protein. So what the heck is it? And why can't you just drink your regular old whey protein? Well, let's look at one of the reasons we usually take whey protein powder after a workout. Or more specifically, why do we take hydrolyzed whey protein powder? Whey protein is what's known as a fast protein. What this essentially means is that your body is able to break it down into amino acids faster. This allows it to be more easily absorbed and utilized. What this does is cause a very high spike in muscle protein synthesis. However, it doesn't last as long. When you buy things like hydrolyzed whey protein powder, it means the protein's been broken down even further through extra processing. As a result, the effect is magnified, an even higher spike for a shorter duration. While this is good for post-workout, a big short spike is not what we want while sleeping. For one, your body's resting, so there's no need for an excessively high MPS spike. In addition, you're sleeping for 8 hours and are better off with a smaller rise that lasts longer. And this is what casein does. Like whey, casein also comes from dairy. When milk is being processed, it's separated into a watery substance, which is whey, and white curds, which is casein. Both are high-quality proteins, meaning they have an optimal amino acid profile. However, unlike whey, casein is slow digesting. Due to its structure, casein is broken down significantly slower than whey, providing a smaller rise for longer, exactly what we're looking for. This was shown clearly in an early study from 1997 with an elementary study design. Feed participants either casein or whey and then take blood samples with various timestamps. It concludes, whey protein induced a dramatic but short increase of plasma amino acids. Casein protein induced a prolonged plateau of moderate hyperaminoacidemia, probably because of a slow gastric emptying. It also noted that casein had slower oxidation and higher leucine content at the 7-hour mark. This is critical as leucine is the primary amino acid in terms of muscle protein synthesis. It quite literally pulls the trigger to activate it. So what does this all mean to you? Well, a couple of things. At the very least, consuming a pre-sleep casein protein drink might be an efficient way to ensure that you get your total protein intake. Some people may have an issue getting in high amounts of protein, so this acts as one extra feeding. As we discussed, this isn't going to cause any unwanted fat gain, assuming it is high quality and doesn't contain a lot of fillers that lead to a surplus of calories. There are sufficient studies to show that taking a casein protein supplement before sleep has a good chance of increasing recovery and reducing muscle soreness. And while studies aren't as abundant, there's also a chance it could actually increase the amount of muscle growth you see. Considering all that, it seems like it's definitely worth adding to your nutrition regime. All you need to do is take 30 to 40 grams of a casein supplement 30 minutes before bed. It's up to you if you choose to use milk or water to mix it with, so see what fits your calorie needs. One thing to remember is that to obtain the best results, long-term adherence seems to be of a benefit. This should become part of your nighttime routine, not just something done once in a while. Another factor to keep in mind about casein is it may also serve as a more effective general protein source. For example, if you're making a breakfast smoothie to start the day, or if you're just having a healthy snack. During these times of non-training, the same rationale that supports casein for pre-sleep protein would apply here. Primarily, you don't need the ultra-fast supply of amino acids from whey under normal conditions, so a slower release casein might provide some benefits. At that same time, due to the consistency of casein, many people find it to be significantly more filling. Compared to whey, it's usually significantly thicker and more filling, making it a great choice to control your appetite. If that sounds interesting, you might want to try it and see for yourself. And don't worry, there's definitely still room for whey as your optimal post-workout protein source. Pre-sleep protein could possibly be the easiest hack there is to improve muscle recovery and muscle growth. And after reviewing all the studies, it seems as if there's a greater chance of seeing benefits than not. Luckily, working it into your routine cannot be simpler. Just drink a protein shake right before bed, and in return, you could unlock gains that were once neglected while you slept. Going to the gym can be the healthiest habit you ever pick up, as long as you do it right. Carelessness and fatigue are just two factors that can cause injury when you're working out. And if you're not careful, you might never work out again. This video is going to share with you the most common dangers in the gym and, more importantly, how to avoid them. You're going to learn the most effective way to reduce your injury rate by 10%. Before the making of this video in late 2023, there was a horrific weightlifting accident caught on tape that became viral. A 33-year-old bodybuilder from Bali by the name of Justin Vicky was performing heavy back squats. He was attempting a 210-kilogram squat, about 462 pounds, when tragedy struck. With a single spotter behind him, Justin began the descent of the squat. Everything was going fine until he hit the bottom of the lift and attempted to come back up. That load proved too heavy, pinning his body in a deep squat position. He then fell back to a sitting position with his head tucked into his chest. From here, the barbell rolled across his shoulders, neck, and head, which powerfully thrust his neck forward. This resulted in his neck snapping, while the nerves to his heart and respiratory systems were compressed. Unfortunately, Justin shortly succumbed to his injuries. What made this even more tragic is that Justin was an experienced lifter who was said to be careful in the gym and preached against ego lifting. What this proves is that anything can happen in the gym to anyone. In fact, it's often experienced lifters that become complacent with safety. In general, weightlifting is a relatively safe sport when compared to other sporting activities. Overall, weightlifting has an injury rate of 1 to 2 injuries per athlete per year, or 2 to 4 injuries per 1,000 hours of training exposure. Compare this to male soccer players' experience at a rate of 8.1 every 1,000 hours. When looking at the numbers in more detail, we're able to find different variables that seem to increase the chance of injury. For example, different styles of weightlifting tend to be more susceptible to certain injuries. Strongman competitors tend to be at a significantly greater risk of bicep injuries, while Olympic weightlifters tend to have a higher propensity for knee injuries. At the same time, men are 7 times more likely to experience an injury, as well as those older than 28 years old and those who spend more than 3 hours in the gym a week. While interesting, we can't do a lot about our sex, age, the amount we train, or the sport we train. We can only keep these in the back of our minds to be more aware. The good thing is there are plenty of variables we do have control over. This video will go over those. These are the top factors that increase the chances of injuries, including habits in the gym, habits outside the gym, and general safety protocols. Paying attention to what we cover will greatly increase your chance of injury-free training this year. Where do injuries occur? One of the biggest ways to stop injuries is to know which areas are more prone. A review on injuries in weightlifting concludes, anatomical locations of injury for the weight training sports suggests that differences in exercise event load, selection, and the actual technique and body positioning in a particular exercise or event can alter the mechanical stress placed on specific anatomical locations and therefore the subsequent injury risk. As most of the general population performs more bodybuilding type styles of training, we can tell you the most common injury sites are the shoulder, the knee, and the lower back. Knowing this allows you to concentrate on specifically strengthening those areas. At the same time, you can also give them extra attention when training. Learn correct technique and use proper progression. To prevent these injuries from occurring, the first thing you need to do is to take time to learn the new movement. When you start a new exercise, use lighter weights as you learn the correct movement patterns. Once you've mastered these patterns, you can then begin to add heavier loads. Starting off with heavy weight makes using good form significantly harder and increases the chance of injury. When done consistently, it simultaneously teaches your neuromuscular system the incorrect movement. When you're ready to add weight, you do so slowly to allow both your muscles and joints to adapt. A general rule is an increase of 5 to 10 pounds for upper body movements and 10 to 20 pounds for lower body movements. Listen to your body and adjust accordingly, leaning toward the conservative side. Learn the common mistakes of a movement along with correct form. As you learn the correct form of a movement, you also learn the most common mistakes. Knowing what not to do is just as important as knowing what to do. For example, during the dumbbell shoulder press, many people bring their arms out to the side of their body, abducted and externally rotated. This causes excessive stress to build in your shoulder joint, which leads to overuse over time. This can be fixed by simply bringing your elbows in slightly. Other common issues are knees caving in during the squat or elbows flaring out during the bench press. Every exercise will have its own specific key points, and it's imperative you learn them. Use a proper warm-up. Now, let's address one of the more obvious injury prevention measures, warm-ups. A warm-up's primary job is to increase muscle and tendon suppleness, to stimulate blood flow to the periphery, to increase body temperature, and to enhance free coordinated movement. They can also increase synovial fluids in the joints, a type of natural lubricant. Now, a proper warm-up includes separate parts. The first is 5 minutes of general warm-up. This is any type of cardio to get your blood pumping and increase your heart rate, such as a treadmill or cycling. If you're training your upper body, you can also think about using an assault bike or an elliptical trainer, as they work your upper body as well. Next, you want to use what's known as dynamic stretching. Dynamic stretching involves bringing a joint through a full range of motion with slight activation of the muscles. For example, butt kicks warm up the knee joint while activating the hamstrings. This will warm up the joint and the muscle in an effective manner. After your dynamic warm-up, you want to move on to your warm-up sets. Warm-up sets. Too often, we see guys too anxious to get into their lifts and start with maximal working loads for their session. Don't do this. Even after a sufficient warm-up, you're not ready to immediately start using heavy loads. This is why you need to use warm-up sets. Warm-up sets are really just a continuation of your warm-up up to your first working set, in contrast to working sets, which are the sets you're performing with your prescribed load. Warm-up sets are lighter sets that you use to build up to your working weight. For example, if you're doing 3 sets of 6 reps at 250 pounds on bench press, you may perform 3 warm-up sets, 1 set of 15 reps with just the bar, 1 set of 6 reps with 155 pounds, and 1 set of 6 reps with 205 pounds. This can vary depending on the person, the lift, and the amount of weight being used. While there haven't been studies that specifically look at the effect of warm-up sets on injuries, we do know they can improve performance, such as producing significantly more force on the bench press and back squats. Correct muscle imbalances. One of the most common causes of injuries in the gym is due to muscle imbalances. When a muscle imbalance occurs, it can throw off proper mechanics and cause the other muscles to overcompensate. This can happen anywhere, but one area of particular concern is the trapezius muscles, or the traps. The traps are the body's primary stabilizers of the scapula. They're in charge of creating a strong base for the shoulder and the arm to function. When these muscles are weak, they create a weak base, which results in overuse and pain in either the shoulder or the elbow as they become overactive to correct the imbalance. For example, case studies have shown how simply strengthening the trap muscle of patients with prolonged elbow pain has been successful at eradicating the pain. Their pain went from a score of 41 to 0. Another common fix is grip strength. Many people ignore their grip, as it's not necessarily the most glamorous muscle. However, weak extensors or flexors are a common cause of elbow pain, as it forces you to overcompensate. Realize the body operates as one long chain. Ignoring a muscle at any part of the chain will force the other locations to compensate, which will eventually lead to injury. Everyone will have their own personalized needs. However, the easiest way to solve this problem is to follow a structured program that gives equal work to all muscle groups and all major movement patterns. Add mobility training. Mobility is another term that tends to be thrown into the mix with flexibility, yet is distinctly different. The best way to think of mobility is flexibility with function. For example, being able to touch your toes requires flexibility, while holding a loaded barbell overhead and doing squats requires mobility in the shoulders and the thoracic spine. Studies show a clear relationship between adding mobility training to one's training and a reduction in injury. By maintaining high levels of mobility in all your joints, you ensure a solid base where no joint will be placed in a compromising position. Get plenty of sleep. Lifters need to sleep. Putting injuries aside for a moment, sleep is the most powerful recovery method we have. During this time, your body releases hormones and puts you in a state for optimal recovery. Missing out on sleep has been shown to increase fat storage, decrease muscle gain, and cause a deficit in performance. However, we now know that lack of sleep decreases cognitive function, including executive function, attention, learning, mental performance, and mental health. All of these can lead to injury. So, how much sleep is enough? More than you might think. Studies show that less than 7 hours of sleep on a consistent basis increases the chance of injury in athletes by 1.7 times. This risk can dramatically increase with a greater reduction in sleep. For example, multiple nights of insomnia puts athletes at a 14.6 times greater risk of concussion. These injuries can be due to decreased strength, slower reaction time, poor coordination, or general clumsiness. Further, lack of sleep generally decreases mood and increases anxiety, which can lead to poor decision-making. Now, the numbers we just spoke about were specifically speaking for athletes. which isn't exactly the same as lifting weights in the gym. However, things can still happen quickly where you need full levels of cognition. In one survey of weightlifters who were injured, a whopping 60% suggested tiredness or fatigue to be the primary cause. Being tired in the gym can easily lead to one forgetting about setting a latch or putting on a lopsided weight. These are all things most lifters have done at least once, and it's simply due to not being in the right headspace. At the same time, being overly tired leads to poor coordination, which spells trouble for some exercises, specifically the free weight movements. Nutritional concerns. Eating a balanced meal with proper calories is another effective way to mitigate injuries. Proper nutrition provides the body with nutrients it needs to support a strong body while giving it energy for optimal performance. One of the first common practices is staying in a low-caloric state for a prolonged period of time. Doing so causes dramatic changes in strength, cognitive function, and fatigue, similar to a lack of sleep. Remember, we just told you how tiredness and fatigue are the presumed cause of 60% of gym injuries. Being in a starved state only increases fatigue. At the same time, a lack of certain nutrients also increases the body's chance of experiencing an injury. For example, women are prone to eating low calories due to heightened issues with body image. They also run a higher risk of developing osteoporosis or the weakening of bone. Studies have shown these two factors combine in the weight room, placing women at an increased risk of bone stress injuries. A quick summary of other common nutrients to be mindful of are protein intake, vitamin C, D, copper, omega-3 fatty acids, or calcium for the prevention of injury to bone, muscle, tendon, and ligament health. This is a significantly more complex issue to thoroughly explore in this video, but be sure to concentrate on eating whole foods. These are simply real foods such as chicken, beef, eggs, fruits, vegetables, etc. Further, be sure to consume an adequate intake of protein of a minimum of 1.4 grams per kilogram of body weight. However, aim to hit 1.6 to 2 grams per kilogram for optimal recovery. Use deloads appropriately. While most lifters have heard of deloads, a surprising amount rarely if ever practice them. For those who aren't aware, a deload is a period of time where you decrease the work put on the muscle. Most scheduled deloads are for 5 to 7 days and occur every 4 to 6 weeks. One of the excuses many guys use to not deload is a loss of gains, as if their body will deteriorate or shrivel away if they don't hit the gym for a week. While it's a funny thought, we understand the mentality. The good thing is that while building muscle is hard, maintaining it is pretty easy. A study found performing just one set to failure per muscle group per week is enough to maintain muscle mass for 32 weeks. You're not losing gains taking a week off, and will likely come back stronger while being injury and pain-free. Therefore, if you hit the gym consistently for 6 weeks, you should seriously consider taking a week off. This allows the body time to fully recover and alleviate any buildup of fatigue. One method is to use the same program, but cut the weight by 50%. You can also spend the time concentrating on mobility or other low-intensity work. Use proper spotting. When a spotter is needed, many guys will call a random person in the gym or a friend. While this is convenient, it doesn't take long on YouTube to find plenty of spotter fail videos. That's because spotting is actually a skill that requires constant attention. For example, with a back squat, the spotter will not be able to control the weight with their hands on the bar. Therefore, the spotter should come behind the lifter and place their arms under the armpits of the lifter. If a lifter begins to fall, the spotter hoists the lifter, pulls the chest back to prevent the lifter from falling forward, and helps the lifter stand. On bench press, the spotter requires experience so they can read things such as bar speed and effort to know if a lifter is going to need help. With ultra-heavy weights, it might be even appropriate to have 3 spotters, 1 in the middle and 2 on either side of the barbell. This will allow all 3 to catch and lift the load in a balanced fashion. The point is that spotting is a skill and it needs practice. For this reason, another, perhaps better option is to use safety bars instead. These are bars that you can place at various heights in a rack that'll catch the bar if needed. For example, if doing squats, measure how far the bar goes at depth, then place the safety bars just below that. If you do miss a lift, you can simply lower the bar until the safety bars catch the barbell. This would have prevented Justin's tragedy. Consider lifting gear. One option for weightlifters is to use weightlifting gear. This can include a weightlifting belt, knee sleeves, elbow sleeves, and wrist wraps. All of these have the potential to reduce injury by different mechanisms. For example, weight belts allow a lifter to increase intra-abdominal pressure, which reduces spinal loading during lifting. Wrist wraps act as a sort of brace to maintain a solid wrist joint. and sleeves help keep a joint warm while offering some assistance. However, for those to work properly, they must be used correctly, as many general lifters are unaware of their proper use. Wrist wraps go around the wrist to minimize wrist movement. Many lifters will actually wear them below the wrist, which offers no support. Sleeves go over the joint where the main concern is a snug fit. Weight belts should be worn around your belly button and tightened as you breathe in. This allows you to press against the belt to create a greater intra-abdominal pressure with what's known as the Valsalva maneuver. This provides greater core strength and helps protect the spine. A few tips. There are a plethora of reasons why your body might hurt during exercise. However, here are 3 tips for some of the more commonly reported aches and pains. If your shoulder is prone to pain, switch to dumbbells as they allow more mobility in the shoulder compared to a barbell. Bring your elbows inward slightly during your overhead pressing to relieve pressure in your joint. During horizontal pressing, keep your elbows tucked. Also, a landmine press works great. If you're prone to elbow pain, try using a neutral grip. This takes the pressure off your extensors and extenders, which in turn relieves pressure from your elbow. If your knee already hurts, stay away from exercises that bring your knee forward. To be clear, these exercises aren't bad for your knees. However, if you do have knee pain, it can cause the pain to flare up. For example, many lifters report pain subsides by performing reverse lunges rather than lunges. You can also concentrate on concentric movements only, such as deadlifts. Continue training in this manner until your joint heals, and gradually increase the range of motion and load. As always, if something hurts, stop and never work through pain. Application. The very first thing you want to do is follow a properly structured program. If you have the resources, seriously consider buying one from a qualified coach. Before you start using heavier loads for the exercises, be sure you spend the time needed to familiarize yourself with them. Pay attention to using proper form as well. Further, be sure to include mobility work in your program. As you work through your program, use appropriate progression to increase the intensity, keeping your own personal needs in mind. A good rule is to increase the load no more than 5 to 10 pounds every week for upper body exercises and no more than 10 to 20 pounds for lower body exercises. Go even slower if you can. At home, remember to eat a diet that consists of primarily whole foods, and don't go on any extreme diets with crazy calorie deficits. If you must, for whatever reason, become accustomed to it before exerting high amounts of energy in the gym. At night, aim to get at least 7 hours of quality sleep. This could have the largest influence on injuries as it keeps your mind sharp while allowing muscles to recover better. Always be mindful of how you feel. If you're feeling especially fatigued one day, consider taking the day off. In fact, you may even need a full deload. Monitor your recovery and performance levels, and when they feel off, have a rest. When doing heavy lifts, have either a spotter or safety bar set up. If you're using a spotter, speak to them before the lift. If using safety bars, be sure they're set up appropriately. If you decide to use gear, take the time to learn how to wear it properly. A little time spent on proper usage can save you from injury later. And always, simply be mindful about what's going on around you. Anything can happen, and often you'll only have a fraction of a second to respond. The first time we went to a gym, we worked with a personal trainer. They asked what our goal was, which was of course to get shredded. So we replied that we wanted to gain some muscle while losing fat. The trainer stepped back and said, "Yeah, that's not going to happen. You can't lose weight and gain muscle at the same time." What a bummer. But how many times have you heard that from someone? It's impossible to build muscle and lose fat at the same time. Well, we have good news for you. Yes, you can, and this video is going to show you how you can run a successful body recomposition. And it's actually not that hard. In fact, there's just 3 key points to follow, so here we go. In the past, the term body recomposition was rarely ever mentioned. It refers to the process of losing fat and gaining muscle at the same time, and has been considered the holy grail of training. However, all the serious lifters knew this was just a pipe dream. To see progress, you either trained for fat loss or you trained for muscle. If you wanted to gain muscle without getting fat, you had to do it in cycles by partaking in multiple bulks and cuts. Everyone knew that. This was mainly believed since fat loss is a catabolic process, while building muscle is an anabolic one. Trying to do both at once would cause something termed metabolic antagonism, resulting in a stalemate. What's crazy is that this was the primary school of thought up until not that long ago. In fact, studies researching body recomposition don't even start to become a real thing until around 2020. If anything, a body recomposition was believed to only be possible for two groups of people. The first group are newbies. The basic explanation was that these individuals were so new to the stimuli of exercise, their bodies had stronger reactions and thus was able to have a successful body recomposition. However, as you train more, your body needs more specific stimuli to grow, and the response occurs to a smaller and smaller degree. And it goes by quick. Once you've been lifting for just a year, you can say bye-bye recomps. The second group are those with a high percentage of body fat. The theory behind this is that their body has so much excess fat, there's plenty of energy readily available. Even if they're in a deficit, the body can still access calories from the excessive stored fat. However, as their body fat percentage lowers, their calories are less accessible, meaning your body won't have the energy to build muscle in a caloric deficit. So again, the leaner you become, the harder it gets to run a successful recomposition. So was this line of thinking completely wrong? Well, actually, they were kind of right. When it comes to these two groups of people, both lifting newbies and those with high body fat percentages, they really will be more likely to see better results in their recomposition. Where the error in the thinking lies is with the idea that the other groups of people can't perform successful recomposition as well. This includes those that have a lower body fat percentage and those who have been training for longer periods of time. Now, this is where our knowledge of exercise science and body recomposition has recently grown. Later, there's been an influx of studies which show that these recompositions are not only possible, but possible for virtually everyone, even elite athletes. This means you too can run a successful recomposition and build muscle and lose fat at the same time, if you follow the guidelines we're going to give you. So get ready, because a lot of these studies are relatively new, like within just the past few years, meaning this might be the first time you've heard these conclusions. Alright, here we go. And we want you to pay special attention to this next part. We hope you're paying attention to everything, but we really want you to pay attention to this upcoming info, since we're now going to tell you what factors will determine a successful body recomposition. We're going to walk through some actual studies, assess their outcomes, and then apply the information to our training. Let's start with nutrition. Out of all the variables that will go into your recomposition, perhaps the most important aspect is going to be your nutrition. We don't say that lightly, as everything is of utmost importance. However, when we look at all the studies on successful recomps, nutrition is addressed consistently, specifically your protein intake. Upping your protein intake is probably the most important practice you'll need to adopt to support your recomposition. In fact, it seems to be the key. To see how effective it is, let's look at a study from Dr. Jose Antonio of ISSN that was performed in 2015. In it, 48 resistance-trained men and women with an average of 2.4 years of training followed an 8-week progressive program using a 5-day split. So right off the bat, you can see these weren't lifting novices. These 48 individuals were then put into two different groups, which differed only by one main variable: their protein intake. We should note they also increased their caloric intake, but we can tell you now that this did not lead to what you think it did. So the normal protein group was supposed to eat 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, but they actually ended up eating more protein than instructed, 2.3 grams per kilogram. As far as calories, they ate 29.3 calories per kilogram of body weight. For example, a 100 kilogram or 220 pound person ate 2,930 calories. Now, the high protein group ate a whopping 3.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, which resulted in 35.7 calories per kilo of body weight. So in this group, a 100 kilogram person would have eaten 3,570 calories. And what happened after the 8 weeks of training was surprising. First, both groups saw a successful recomposition. Further, both gained on average 1.5 kilograms of muscle. However, things differed when it came to fat loss. The high-protein group lost on average 1.6 kilograms of fat, while the normal protein group only lost 0.3 kilograms. This resulted in a greater decrease than that of the normal protein group, with a loss of 2.4% versus 0.6%. To be clear, even though the high-protein group consumed nearly 22% more calories at 35.7 per kilogram versus 29.3 per kilogram, they lost 5 times more fat than the low-protein group. This means an 80-kilogram man would still lose more weight even though they were eating an extra 500 calories a day. How is that possible? The most likely reason is due to protein's high thermal effect of food. The thermal effect of food is basically the amount of calories needed to actually digest and transport the food. As you can imagine, protein is significantly harder for your body to digest. Think steak versus rice. It's estimated that protein has a thermal effect of food of around 20 to 30%, That means if you eat 1,000 calories of protein, your body will burn 200 to 300 calories just to digest it. To further illustrate this, Dr. Antonio did another high-protein study using 4.4 grams per kilogram. Even though the individuals in the high-protein group ate 800 more calories, they did not see any gain in fat. So how does this apply to you? Well, while your protein intake seems to be the key part of your diet for recomposition, your training still matters. Eating a ton of chicken and steak will definitely get your protein up, but it's not enough on its own to significantly increase muscle mass. You know how hard you need to train to gain muscle under normal conditions? Well, when you're doing a recomposition, it's even harder. In 2016, Dr. Antonio performed yet another study using high-protein diets. These individuals ate anywhere from 2.3 to 3.2 grams per kilogram of body weight while following a resistance training program. However, unlike in his earlier study, these individuals saw no significant improvements in their body composition, even though they trained for a year. So why are we telling you about a study with no results? Well, that's because it actually has significant implications. Dr. Antonio addressed this contradicting result and noted one primary difference between the two studies. You see, the individuals in his 2015 study were put on a proper resistance training program which utilized periodization and progressive overload. Periodization is a method of altering the total volume and load you lift throughout your program to create different stimuli for greater adaptation. In other words, instead of lifting just 3 sets of 10 reps for exercises, you might also use 3 sets of 5 reps and 3 sets of 15 reps. In this study, they used 4 rep ranges to hit the muscle, including 3 sets of 5 reps, 3 sets of 8 reps, 3 sets of 10 reps, and 3 sets of 12 reps. The study also used progressive overload. Progressive overload is the principle that says to ensure consistent growth, you must constantly place a slightly larger demand on the muscle over time. In other words, you need to lift more weight, more reps, or more sets. In comparison, those in his 2016 study trained but were simply instructed to train, quote, as usual. In other words, they weren't using a well-structured training program. With that said, they still tracked their training, including their volume, and it's here that the researchers found out the likely cause for no improvement. There was no increase in total training volume. This is a crucial factor. Training volume is basically the total amount of work you perform in the weight room. This might be calculated as set volume, which measures the amount of working sets, or total volume, which is the summation of all the weight you lifted, found by the equation sets times reps times load. By not increasing their total volume, the study group essentially never increased the amount they lifted throughout the program. So they never put a greater stress on their muscles. In this condition, we shouldn't expect to see any increase in muscle mass. You see, volume is the most important variable that influences muscle growth. There have been dozens of studies that show a clear dose-response relationship with volume and muscle growth. If you want your muscles to grow, you have to increase your volume. Those in this study didn't. In fact, that's exactly what Dr. Antonio concluded in his study, saying, thus, one would speculate that without significant changes in the training stimulus, the mere provision of extra protein would likely not lead to changes in body composition. Therefore, don't forget the same principles apply for muscle growth when you're doing a recomposition. This means you must increase the volume on a weekly basis. If you don't, you'll still maintain your muscle mass, but there will be not enough stimuli for more growth. Now let's take a closer look at what the actual programs entailed. Going back to Dr. Antonio's 2015 study, we already discussed how it utilized periodization with progressive overload. More specifically, the trainees were put on a 5-day split with 5 to 8 exercises in each session. The exercises included your basics such as bench press, machine military press, dips, lat pull down, and back squats. Now let's look at another study from 2018, which saw a successful body recomposition with female physique competitors. This study used a 4-day upper-lower split for an 8-week program. This equated to 2 upper body and 2 lower body sessions each week. The upper body days used 6 exercises per session and included exercises such as barbell rows, overhead press, and assisted pull-ups. The lower body day used 5 exercises per session and included back squats, deadlifts, and hip thrusts. Further, it too used periodization training throughout the 8 weeks, using rep ranges of 3 to 5, 9 to 11, and 14 to 16. Now, this study also used HIIT, or high-intensity interval-style training. Participants completed a prescribed amount of 30-second maximum efforts with their choice of exercise, such as treadmill, cycling, etc. Starting with 4 rounds in weeks 1 and 2, they added 1 set every 2 weeks, ending by performing 7 sets on weeks 7 and 8. We want to point out that this study also looked at high protein. 2.5 grams per kilogram versus low protein of 0.9 grams per kilogram. At the end of the study, the participants in the high-protein group gained 2.1 kilos of muscle versus 0.6 kilograms in the low-protein group. The high-protein group also lost 1.1 kilograms of fat, while the low-protein group saw no decrease. What makes this study stand out was that again the participants were seasoned, trained physique competitors. This meant that not only were they experienced lifters, they also had lower body fat percentage. This completely disproves the belief that only noobs and overweight individuals are able to run a successful body recomp. Another factor that's going to affect your success is your sleep, so you need to get your Z's in. Now let's be clear, your sleep is always an important factor when you're training. Heck, sleep is an important factor if you train or not, which you'll soon see. However, the importance of sleep is multiplied when running a body recomposition. To see how much of a role sleep plays in your body composition, pay attention to this eye-opening study from 2018. In it, 41 overweight individuals were put on an 8-week calorie-restricted diet, which equaled about a 30% reduction in their baseline calories. Everything was similar, except one variable. You guessed it, their sleep. One group had a normal amount of sleep, while the other sleep was cut short, but not by that much. They probably didn't want the study to be too cruel, so the sleep restriction group simply missed out on 1 hour of sleep of their baseline, which equated to about 6.5 hours of sleep. However, what's interesting is that this was only for 5 days a week. The other 2 days they were allowed to sleep as much as they wanted, which equated to about 1 hour longer than their baseline, or 8.5 hours. This was to mimic real life and the idea of catching up on the weekend. What they found was that both groups lost the same amount of body weight, 3.2 kilograms. However, what is crazy is where the weight came from, since they didn't lose weight in the same ways. The median proportions of fat loss was 83% for normal sleep and 58% for sleep deprivation. That means that the normal sleep group showed a significantly greater ability to burn fat while they slept. On the flip side, the median proportions of lean mass loss was 17% for the normal sleep group and 39% for the sleep deprivation group. That means you could expect to burn twice as much muscle if you're sleep deprived. When put together, this means that getting normal sleep primes the body to preserve muscle and burn fat. Similar results were seen in another study where 5.5 hours of sleep opposed to 8.5 hours resulted in 55% less fat burned and 60% more muscle burned. We should note that these groups weren't involved in resistance training. However, this shows just how beneficial sleep can be. Considering that just about every other study shows sleep deprivation is associated with poor performance and composition outcomes, you should definitely be getting to bed early if we were trying to lose fat and build muscle simultaneously. After looking at the science, it seems that running a recomposition isn't terribly different from general muscle gain. The primary difference is the high amount of protein you eat and the overemphasis of progressive overload. The thing is, when we say high protein, we mean higher than normal protein intake for bodybuilders, which is already considered high. But we have some specific tips that'll benefit anyone, not just professionals and competitors. Remember that when people ate protein in the amount of 2.3 grams per kilogram of body weight, they would still have a successful recomposition. However, eating more, upwards of 3.3 grams per kilogram, produce significantly better results. Therefore, you should try to maintain as high a protein intake as possible, but try to make 2.5 grams per kilogram your minimum. This is the amount used in the study with the physique competitors. Doing so is going to take more intention on your part. Getting in this much protein can be tough, so make sure to use a high-quality protein powder to aid in your protein intake. In addition, also consider taking advantage of a pre-sleep protein shake. Not only will this increase your overall protein intake, studies show that consumption of 20 to 40 grams of casein approximately 30 minutes before sleep will improve recovery and possibly aid in greater muscle growth. The reason casein is mentioned specifically is it's slow digesting. This results in a longer, steady, heightened rate of muscle protein synthesis as opposed to whey. This protein should then be divided into 4 to 6 feedings across the day. This will ensure your body has a steady flow of amino acids to aid in muscle recovery and prevent any breakdown of muscle. Second, get your calories right. For normal weight loss, the guideline is to eat a 300 to 500 calorie deficit. However, this is when losing weight is your primary goal. When it comes to a body recomposition, prescribing calories gets a bit more nuanced. If you're able to maintain very high levels of protein, you can theoretically get away with eating more calories. Remember Dr. Antonio's study. The higher protein group ate an extra 6.3 calories per kilogram yet still lost more weight. However, we can also anecdotally look at what happens when new trainees and overweight people do a recomposition. These groups are generally in a caloric deficit, but their body's able to still build muscle. Therefore, when you start, stay in a deficit, but toward the lower end, like 300 max. Like always, you will then need to assess your weight and composition as you move forward to see if you need to make adjustments. A quick note on tracking your progress. It's going to be tough as you'll need access to some sort of body composition testing, but this is the only way to actually tell if weight fluctuation is coming from muscle gain, fat loss, fat gain, etc. And if you do have access, be sure to use the same machine every time you test. Third, utilize a proper resistance training program. This primarily means using a program that emphasizes progressive overload by increasing your weekly training volume. In addition, the two studies we talked about focused on using bigger compound movements: bench press, chin-ups, squats, overhead press, etc. Make this the majority of your training. Also, don't forget that we looked at two successful studies that both utilized periodization. Unfortunately, as of to date, there are no studies that have compared different training methods in recomposition. For example, periodized versus non-periodized. So we can't say for sure that a periodized plan will definitely work better. However, we can say a periodized plan was successful in multiple studies. But keep in mind that running a recomposition will take time. It's a slower process, but it cuts out the need to bulk and cut. It makes it very useful for anyone who hates the yo-yoing of bulking and cutting, or if there's anyone who just really doesn't want to gain weight in bulk. Regardless of your reason, the successful body recomposition cuts out all the extra steps. It may take some time to see how your body responds and how much control you have over your protein intake. However, once you do, it's bye-bye to the endless cycle of bulking and cutting, and hello to a bigger and more shredded body simultaneously. You will never see a more significant transformation than in your first 365 days of training. Your muscles are simply primed for growth. This glorious time of unsubstantiated growth has been termed newbie gains and will be unmatched for the rest of your lifting career. But to what extent can you really expect your muscles to grow in your first year of lifting? And are there ways you can maximize your potential? We'll explain this period of awesome gains in greater detail and provide specific answers to both those questions. Why do you want to start going to the gym? It's the first question most trainers ask. But honestly, we don't even need to give you time to think, as we already know the answer: to get big. If you're like the vast majority of lifters who have given themselves this new goal in life, one of your primary reasons to even start lifting is to grow muscle. But how much can we reasonably expect to grow in 1 year? To answer that, let's first start with a short story. In 1973, a man named Casey Viator joined one of the craziest studies in sports science that we've ever seen, called the Colorado Experiment, where Arthur Jones, the inventor of Nautilus training equipment, conducted a 28-day study to prove that rapid muscle hypertrophy was possible. In it, a group of men trained every other day using a special program. This program included performing one set of 10 to 14 different exercises. Each set was done to complete failure, which is where you can't even complete even a single repetition at the end of each set. After the study, Casey had gained an astonishing 63 pounds of muscle. You heard that right. It's reported that Casey had gained 63 pounds of muscle in just 28 days. So does this mean you can expect to see those same results? Well, probably not. Depending on who you ask, this story is either a testament to dedication or a simple example of great marketing. And even if it was true, it would be a 1 in a billion experience. Still, thanks to social media and influencers, we are constantly bombarded with absolutely insane body transformations that spew out completely unrealistic numbers. Those bogus claims lead to many starting their fitness journey with the expectation that they'll be gracing the covers of fitness mags in just 365 days. If putting on muscle was as easy as putting on fat, that might be true. Unfortunately, it's not. A wise person once said, "Good things come to those who wait." Another wise person also said, "Slow and steady wins the race," and both of those quotes can be applied to building muscle. That's because building muscle is a long, slow process that takes consistency and dedication. However, if you stick with it, you'll surely be rewarded for your hard work. And luckily, 1 year is more than enough time to see some amazing results. In fact, it'll probably be your best year. To determine how much muscle we can expect to grow in 1 year for a newbie, we must first examine the rate at which muscle grows. In 2007, a large meta-study was conducted that looked over 200 studies to identify the average increase in muscle mass that occurred with differences in training variables. The study looked at individual muscles and tracked how much they grew each day. For quadriceps, the average increase seen under training was 0.11% per day, but some grew as fast as 0.26%. For biceps, the average increase was 0.20% per day, with 0.33% being the largest. Keep in mind that the studies being looked at included both trained and untrained individuals using a plethora of different variables. With that in mind, untrained and sedentary individuals will tend to have a greater response due to the novelty of the stimuli. However, even within this group of new lifters, there's still a large variety of response. The old adage, life isn't fair, also applies to building muscle in your first year. Everyone has a different story to tell. For example, take a look at this study in 2005 that examined the difference in muscle growth in untrained subjects undergoing bicep training. This was a huge study, using 585 men and women who had not trained in at least 1 year. They were then put on a 12-week progressive overload program, which is a type of strength training that involves gradually increasing the intensity or difficulty. And the results? Well, they were mixed. On average, the trainees' biceps increased by 15 to 20% over the entire 12 weeks. However, some trainees saw an increase of 55%, but at the same time, some trainees actually saw a decrease of 5%. This means there was a range of -5% to +55% on muscle growth. So, what causes the difference in growth? Well, a few things. First, the one area you have no control over: genetics. Our individual genetics can exert great effort on how much muscle we grow. For example, a mutation in your MTSN gene. Your MTSN gene is responsible for encoding what's known as myostatin. Myostatin regulates muscle growth by actually impeding it. In other words, when myostatin is present, it prevents muscle growth. Research has found that when there are mutations in this MTSN gene, it prevents the production of myostatin. As a result, the individual is able to grow significantly more muscle faster. In fact, it's reported that pro strongman Eddie Hall has this mutation, a real-life Hercules. On the other hand, there are what are called non-responders, or those who don't respond to the stimuli of resistance training in the same degree as, quote, normal people. A 2011 study attempted to identify what caused differences in muscle growth, so they placed 56 active but untrained men on a 5-day-a-week training program for 12 weeks. At the same time, they were looking for the presence of something called microRNAs. These microRNAs are non-coding RNA molecules that regulate muscle protein synthesis. Then they compared the muscle gain of the top 20% with the bottom 20% and found that there could be up to a 4 times difference in muscle growth between the highest and lowest groups. In addition, there was a correlation between expressions of various microRNAs with the low and high responders. Unfortunately, or even fortunately depending on where you land on the spectrum, there's absolutely nothing you can do about this. So while it's interesting to know, let's look at some factors you do have control over during your first year. First, to optimize your muscle growth, you have to eat right. When we train, we place a ton of stress on our bodies. This stress breaks down muscle, which then requires fuel to rebuild. Short disclaimer, there's a ton of nuance with losing fat and gaining muscle together, and we'll touch on that later, but generally, you need to focus on one or the other. So first, you need to eat. You need those calories for energy to build new muscle. In fact, without it, you might actually lose muscle. Therefore, getting in a daily surplus of 300 to 500 calories will help maximize your growth. Second, you gotta up your protein. Protein is made up of amino acids, the building blocks of muscle, which are responsible for repairing damaged muscle and promoting muscle growth. Your new training will cause extra muscle damage, increasing your protein needs. Skimping out on protein as a new lifter could literally mean forfeiting gains in your first year, and there's studies to back this up. In 2007, a study used 19 untrained men in a 10-week resistance training study. These men were put into 2 groups. The first group consumed a protein-free shake with 20 grams of dextrose before and after training, so 40 grams total. The second group drank a shake consisting of 20 grams of protein before and after training, also 40 grams total. Every other variable was virtually the same, including their program. At the end of 10 weeks, the carb group gained 2.7 kilograms of muscle mass, while the protein group gained 5.6 kilograms, almost 2 times as much. With that said, try to eat at least 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. However, 2 grams per kilogram might even produce better results. And here we need to talk about carbs. We know that keto and low-carb diets are all the rage these days. We're not going to get into the intricacies of keto, but we will say don't do it if building muscle is your goal. While researchers still don't understand the exact mechanisms, new research shows that carb intake has a role in muscle hypertrophy. As such, studies have found that keto can affect the total amount of muscle one can gain. To see this play out with untrained lifters, let's look at another study. In 2020, this study specifically looked at the effect of keto on untrained individuals. The study put two groups of trainees on a resistance program for 8 weeks, a keto group and a traditional diet group. After the 8 weeks of training, the trainees on a keto diet made no notable changes in lean body mass. On the contrary, those who followed a traditional diet saw an increase of 2.8 kilograms. It's important to note that both groups ate 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, so the only difference was the amount of carbs. With that in mind, save the low-carb diets for later, as they're definitely not ideal when muscle mass is your #1 goal. What's considered low-carb? There's no specific definition, but you'll likely see much better results with at least 2 to 3 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight. Another factor that'll affect muscle gain in your first year is supplements. Will you do this 100% natural, or will you use some nutrition supplements? While we already talked about protein shakes, now we're going to talk about things like creatine and, well, we're just going to talk about creatine. That's because creatine is by far the most powerful supplement on the market. It's the most studied and the most effective supplement we can take to increase our muscle growth. If you're trying to increase muscle mass and not taking creatine, you're doing it wrong. In long-term studies, trainees taking creatine gained up to twice as much muscle mass as those who didn't. This equates to about an extra 4 pounds in 12 weeks of training. In short, you should expect to gain a lot more muscle during your first year of training if you're taking creatine. But wait, genetics strikes again. While creatine is fantastic, genetics plays a role here too. There's about a 20% chance you're either a non-responder or a quasi-responder to creatine. If this is you, you're not going to see the same results as responders. And of course, then there's your actual training. Everyone wants a secret program to put on as much muscle mass as possible. Well, it turns out that it doesn't really matter what you do during your first year of training, that is, as long as you follow some basic guidelines. First, follow a program emphasizing progressive overload. That means following a program that gets more difficult over time. Your body will quickly acclimate to whatever you're doing, so you have to keep challenging it. You're simply not going to grow if you don't give your body a reason. Second, concentrate on increasing that progressive overload by increasing total volume. During your first year, this extra volume will be able to come from simply adding small increments of weight on the bar. More weight on the bar equals bigger muscles. Third, studies show that training a muscle 2 to 3 times a week provides the best results. This is true for both trained and untrained individuals. That means you've got to give your body time to rest. Even if you're excited to hit the gym every single day, you've got to give your body some time to relax and grow those muscles you're working on. Fourth, train with maximal intensity or very close to it. Some studies have shown that when trained to failure, untrained individuals can see maximal progress when using just one set in the upper body muscles. In recent years, there's been growing evidence that it's better to train a couple reps shy of failure, as it produces similar amounts of hypertrophy and strength while reducing overall fatigue. But regardless of whether you go to failure or stop just before, the real point is that intensity plays a major role, especially in untrained lifters. And fifth, stick with compound movements your first year. That means exercises like squats, bench press, and deadlifts. Multiple studies have shown that when training appropriately, a single joint exercise like seated leg curls provide no benefit to a training program for novice lifters. On the other hand, compound exercises not only decrease the time needed, they also elicit greater gains in strength. So, we're not saying don't ever use isolation, but focus on using compound movements to make up the majority of your program, especially during your first year. So we just reviewed some of the factors that will affect your muscle growth in your first year. But what does all this mean for us? We've mostly been focused on those looking at gaining muscle in their first year. However, we know there are a lot of people who want to lose fat while gaining muscle when they first start training, what we call a body recomposition. In the past, it's usually been thought that this can't happen. However, there are an increasing amount of studies that show this is actually possible. This is especially true during your first year of training. As a new lifter in your first year, the stimuli of the weights will be completely new, causing a massive response. For example, in 2006, a study using recreational bodybuilders showed a 10-week program resulted in a gain of 5 kilograms of muscle mass while decreasing 1.5 kilograms of fat. Remember, these men were novices, not completely untrained, which suggests that 100% untrained could see even better results. As long as you don't eat an excess amount of calories, you can probably expect to see a loss of fat on some level. This will largely depend on your starting body fat percentage. However, just be sure you stick with one goal for your first year. Don't try to get huge and shredded for that first summer. If you're really concerned with dropping fat in your first year, we recommend you eat an even higher amount of protein, since the one common variable in most studies that show a successful body recomp is high protein. Dr. Jose Antonio from ISSN did a fascinating study on just this in 2022. He used 2 groups of trainees on an 8-week program. The 2 groups were a normal protein group who received 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass and a high protein group who received 3.4 grams per kilogram. At the end of the 8 weeks, both groups saw an increase in fat-free mass of 1.5 kilograms. Now, what's intriguing is even though the high-protein group consumed significantly more calories than the normal group due to the additional calories from the protein, they actually had a greater decrease in body fat, with the higher protein group losing an average of 1.6 kilos of fat versus 0.3 kilograms lost by the normal group. But how long must you wait to start seeing results? Fortunately for you, this doesn't take a year. Far from it. This is important, as seeing growth can be just the motivating factor you need to keep pushing forward. You're not going to see any noticeable changes right away, as your body needs time to repair itself and grow. In fact, you'll likely see no change at all for the first few weeks. It's going to take about a month to start seeing some noticeable results, then another 1 to 2 months to see some significant changes. While that may seem like a long time to wait, trust us, it's worth it. What seems to happen to everybody is that one day they wake up, go to the shower, and catch themselves in the mirror. All of a sudden, they can see all their hard work is paid off. Maybe it's a bicep vein poking through, or your delts have a nice little cap. Whatever it is you notice first, it's one of the best highs you'll get in your lifting career. So, what's the real answer? How much muscle can you realistically expect to put on in your first year of training? Well, we've gone over quite a few different studies and saw significant gains. For example, some of the studies suggest 5 kilograms in 10 weeks, 2.8 kilograms in 8 weeks, 5.6 kilograms in 10 weeks, or 5 kilograms in 12 weeks. Those numbers fall in line with what you can expect in your first year, anywhere from half a kilogram to 2 kilograms per month, with an average of 1 kilogram per month. This means you might be able to grow 24 kilograms or over 50 pounds of muscle in your first year. Well, not exactly. Recall that there is a range in the rate of growth, and while it would be nice, those higher rates of growth won't stay consistent throughout the year. In fact, you'll only see the maximum rate of growth for the first few months. While there haven't really been any specific studies that have examined this long term, it's estimated that the maximum amount of time one might see higher rates of growth is 20 weeks, which is followed by a decrease. With that said, an increase of 20 to 25 pounds will be an average amount of muscle growth in your first year of training. Knowing how much you can gain is pretty cool, but how does it impact our training? Well, as you saw, there was a significant amount of variance in the study results. This variance is a result of the many factors that can affect your growth. While some of these you can't control, there are quite a few you can. To ensure you maximize your growth in the first year, we highly encourage you to remember a few things to maximize your gains in 365 days. First, get in a 300 to 500 calorie surplus. Second, make sure you eat enough protein, at least 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. However, eating 2 grams might produce even better results and may even be more effective for a body recomp. Remember, no low-carb diets. Eat 2 to 3 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight. As for supplements, if you're going to take one, take creatine. Get enough rest, including sleep, 7 to 9 hours every night. And follow a structured program that emphasizes progressive overload by increasing volume, focuses on compound movements, and trains each muscle 2 times per week. Easy, right? But whether you have that mutated MSTN gene or are stuck with regular old genes like most of us, the amount of muscle you gain shouldn't really have any massive effect on your training. Your job in the gym is to always give 100% effort and train consistently. Then, you just gotta fuel, rest, and do it all over again. If you do that, you've done your job. This repetition and consistency is the true secret of maximizing your muscle mass in year 1 of training and for all of the years beyond that first one. How long should you actually rest between sets to maximize muscle growth? Should you do your sets as quickly as possible or take a long break in between? Could the amount of time you're actually taking be hurting your performance and costing you gains? Well, new scientific research has the answer to those exact questions and will finally reveal how long you should rest between sets to optimize muscle growth. When it comes to prescribing an exercise, there are 4 variables you must decide on that could affect its outcome: the load or how much weight to use, the amount of sets to do, the amount of repetitions or reps per set, and finally, how much rest between sets to use. Rest refers to the length of time spent between performing sets. This time allows the body to recover from the previous set by replenishing ATP and letting our physiological systems come back to homeostasis, things like our blood pressure and heart rate. Ultimately, we rest because we're not machines. Our bodies need these periods of rest to perform more work. Therefore, the issue isn't if we should rest, it's how long we should rest to maximize muscle growth. It sounds simple, but this is where the question gets complicated. Depending on who you ask, this ideal rest period may lay anywhere on a range of time from a short 30 seconds to a long 5-minute or longer rest. The primary determinant is what the person believes the rest period is used for. Before we go further, we need to define what is meant by short or long in terms of rest. Short is generally used to define rest from 30 to 90 seconds. On the other hand, longer rest periods are believed to be ideal for strength gains. This is generally described as anything that's 2 minutes or longer. Traditionally, muscle growth has been associated with things like drop sets, supersets, and training to failure to elicit a thing known as metabolic stress. Metabolic stress is one of the 3 major mechanisms we need for muscle growth, the other 2 being muscle tension and muscle damage. To illustrate its importance, in 2010, Dr. Schoenfeld released a large meta-analysis on the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy. In it, he concludes that current research suggests that maximum muscle gains and muscle hypertrophy are achieved by training regimens that produce significant metabolic stress while maintaining a moderate degree of muscle tension. Not only do shorter rest times increase metabolic stress, they're also believed to cause more muscle damage and muscle fatigue, other mechanisms that trigger muscle growth. As such, in the past, shorter rest periods have been the go-to prescription for maximal gains. The 2010 meta mentioned before even recommends 60 to 90 seconds for optimal hypertrophy training. In fact, this still tends to be the practice most people follow when muscle growth is the goal. But does that mean that it's the best? Well, over recent years, our understanding of hypertrophy training has grown quite a bit. Many of the lessons passed down as canon from gym buddy to gym buddy have turned out to be, well, not as correct as we once thought. And this includes what we know about rest periods. As we move forward, there's one thing we first want to address. You'll often hear these questions phrased as which is better, which is fine. However, we often hear the answer as absolute. If choice A is better, then choice B is bad. But that's the completely wrong way to look at it. You need to understand that both short and long rest periods can be good for muscle growth. We just have the luxury to determine which is optimal. With that said, let's see if we can determine the best amount of rest for maximum muscle growth. To determine the optimal amount of time we need for rest, we first need to determine what the ultimate goal is from our rest. What exactly are we hoping to achieve from it? What is it about rest that affects muscle growth? We already mentioned that in the past, shorter rest periods were believed to be ideal, as they allowed a greater amount of metabolic damage. And one study that backs up this theory was performed in 2018. In this study, 2 groups of trainees used 2 different loading schemes and rest periods. The first group used a 20 RM load, that's repetition maximum, with a 30-second rest interval, while the second group used an 8 RM load with a 3-minute rest interval. And at the end of the study, the 30-second rest group demonstrated more metabolic stress and greater hypertrophic adaptations. That seems pretty clear. Using shorter rest periods for more metabolic stress wins. Case closed, right? Well, not exactly, as we left out one important aspect. Other than the fact that the loads were different, in this study the total volume was controlled so that both groups performed the same amount of volume. In short, volume is the total amount of work that we place on the muscle. We usually compute this as volume equals sets times reps times load. In simple terms, it's how much you lift. With that in mind, the volume was systematically controlled to remain the same for the 2 groups of lifters. While this is interesting, this isn't how the real world works. Let's compare 2 possibilities. Let's say you're performing 3 sets of bicep curls. Which do you think will allow for more volume? 30 seconds of rest or 3 minutes of rest. Obviously, using 3 minutes would. The shorter you rest, the harder it'll be to do the same amount of volume multiple times. Remember this little thought experiment as it'll come up again. Therefore, what the study tells us is that if total volume is equal, then metabolic stress may play a determining factor in causing greater muscle growth. As such, in this scenario, using shorter rests is important. However, this scenario is highly unlikely to play out in the real world, so it's not directly applicable to what we're looking for. Other reasons someone might suggest a shorter rest period is for things like hormonal secretion or getting the pump. Everyone has chased the pump before, so let's look at that. Back in the day, we used to think that the pump was just a transitory period when blood flow increased and engorged our muscles. The muscle would then look extra jacked for a little bit and allowed us to take some insane social pics. However, the blood would eventually flow and you'd go back to looking just sorta jacked. Well, good news! We now know that the pump actually plays a role in hypertrophy. Scientifically known as cell swelling, this pump does seem to have an anabolic property. The mechanisms aren't 100% clear, but it's thought to have something to do with the buildup of metabolites or the triggering of anabolic hormonal release. A simple study from 2022 demonstrated this by comparing muscle swelling to muscle growth during a 6-week study. They concluded that the greater the muscle swelling immediately after the first session of RT, that's resistance training, the greater the muscle hypertrophy after RT. Pretty straightforward. As greater pumps are built with smaller rest intervals, this might be it. Everyone loves chasing the pump, but just like before, the volume for the groups in the study stayed the same for each group. But once again, this isn't how it works in reality, so we again can't directly apply it to our own answer. Instead of going any further, we'll just tell you right now, there are numerous processes that increase muscle growth. A lot. However, there is one training variable that sits as king. And this brings us to what we now know we want to achieve. As you probably have guessed from our examples above, increasing total volume should be the primary goal for our rest periods. What about the other variables, such as metabolic stress? Keep in mind, those are not competing against each other. Rather, they're all working and interacting with one another to maximize muscle growth. Therefore, they all affect muscle growth. However, only one can reign as supreme, and that honor goes to volume. The relationship between training volume and muscle hypertrophy is one of the clearest and most studied interactions that exists with the science of resistance training. For example, in 2017, a meta-analysis looked at 15 different studies that researched this relationship. In it, they concluded that there is a clear dose-response relationship between weekly volume and muscle growth. Another study from 2017 titled Volume for Muscle Hypertrophy and Health Outcomes, the most effective variable in resistance training, concluded that when equated, volume seems one of, if not the most important factors affecting muscle hypertrophy, as long as training has sufficient intensity. We could go on and on, but with what we know now, increasing total volume is king. It's now interesting to note that this last study also gives guidance on improving muscle growth, one of which is to use appropriate rest intervals. So we'll ask you to recall the question we asked earlier concerning what would allow more volume, 30-second rest or 3-minute rest. Obviously, it was the 3 minutes of rest. But even though this seems pretty straightforward and obvious, we can look at a study just to be sure. In 2016, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld led a study that specifically asked this very question. 2 groups of men, a short rest group and a long rest group, ran a full-body resistance training program for 8 weeks. The short rest group used 1-minute rest intervals, while the long rest group used 3 minutes, with all other variables being similar. At the end of the study, the long group saw greater muscle hypertrophy and strength, which is believed to be due to the significantly larger amounts of volume allowed by the longer rest periods. So now you're probably asking, how long should I rest? You may think if 2 minutes is better than 1 minute, 10 minutes will put me on the path to IFBB Pro. While this makes sense, it would only be true if 10 minutes allowed more volume and if you don't mind a 3-hour workout. So while we all know that in general, longer is better than shorter, this doesn't mean you should watch all of Pumping Iron between your sets. Heck, don't even watch this entire video between your sets. In 2022, a study wanted to isolate the rest interval to see if it had any effect on muscle growth independently. They compared the muscle growth of a group that used 1-minute rest intervals to a group that used 3-minute intervals. However, the volume was equated for. They concluded that rest intervals of 1 or 3 minutes produce similar hypertrophic increases provided VL, that's volume load, is equated between conditions. In other words, resting longer only helps if it allows more volume, otherwise it's just wasting time. The issue with this is determining your personal threshold. How much rest do you need to wait for maximal reps? Luckily, there's been studies to help you determine that. A study from 2004 used 28 men to perform the bench press on 3 different days. Each day, they used different rest periods, 1, 3, and 5 minutes. They found that both the 3 and 5-minute rest days allowed for significantly more volume compared to 1 minute for all men. However, things aren't so clear when comparing 3-minute rest to 5-minute rest. Some of the men were able to perform more reps with the 5-minute rest than they could with the 3 minutes, albeit being less substantial than the difference between 1 and 3 minutes. At the same time, however, some men weren't able to perform any more reps using the 5-minute rest. All they needed was 3 minutes for maximal volume. We learned 3 important factors in the study. First, the return will decrease the longer you rest. Are you willing to rest an extra 30 seconds if it allows 4 more reps? What about waiting 1 more minute if it only allows 1 more rep? At a certain point, it'll not be worth it to wait longer as it'll yield less return. However, this payoff will be different from person to person. Secondly, there's a maximum yield at some point. Everyone will reach a point where waiting longer won't produce any more reps. At this point, your rest period really does just become a waste of time. And thirdly, as we discussed, the optimal rest time will really differ from person to person, so you'll have to figure out what works best for you. Theoretically, you want to rest the shortest amount of time that allows the maximal amount of reps. This should then be weighed against how much time you have. The issue in prescribing a perfect time is that everyone is different. Some people have more efficient recovery systems than others, like in the study we just discussed. In addition, some people may only have 40 minutes to spend in the gym, while others have 2 hours. This means that some people will need to take shorter, longer rest periods than others to optimize their training session. So what do we do? Well, we might have an answer out of left field. What if we don't prescribe specific rest intervals? What if we let every person choose how long to rest? In 2016, a study compared a self-selected rest period to a 2-minute rest period for 4 exercises: squat, leg press, bench press, and bicep curl. The participants performed 3 sets to failure, and total reps and volume were then compared. They found that total volume and reps were similar for both groups, yet the self-selected group generally rested shorter than 2 minutes on average. This fits perfectly. We don't need to be on our knees watching the seconds tick by before we're allowed to do our next set. Rather, we need to respect the time frame prescribed, but if we feel better a few seconds before, go for it. Or if you don't feel ready yet, feel free to wait a little longer. We do need to reiterate that this form of autoregulation only works for experienced lifters. These individuals are familiar with their bodies and what recovery feels like. If you're a beginner, just stick to a prescribed set of time for your rest until you have a better body awareness. There's still one more variable to consider. What exercise are you performing? As you can probably guess, doing big compound exercises, such as back squats, require more recovery time than smaller accessory work or isolations like bicep curls. The good news is that a study from 2016 specifically looked at this for us too. Well, not just for us, but for everyone, you get the idea. But they concluded that smaller work such as chest flies require about 2 minutes of rest, while compound lifts like bench press require 3 to 5 minutes. So what does all this mean for you? It means that longer rest intervals are more beneficial for muscle growth as long as they allow more volume. Once you've hit maximum volume, resting longer turns into wasting time. Therefore, optimal rest times would have you rest at the shortest amount of time you need to hit maximal volume. As everyone's different, it's impossible to give you an exact number for everybody, but we do have enough information to provide you with some useful guidelines. If we were to take nothing else into consideration, roughly 5-minute rest intervals across the board for every exercise would be optimal to ensure you're taking enough time. But we know most people aren't trying to wait around that long in the gym. Therefore, the numbers we would suggest you start with are 3.5 to 4 minutes for your primary movements. These are the heaviest and most taxing movements, like squats, deadlift, bench press, shoulder press, and are the ones you should typically do first. Next up are the major compound movements. These are also compound movements but use lighter weight and will often be paired with a similar primary movement. For example, if you did bench press that day, dumbbell press or incline press could be a major compound movement. If you did a back squat, you'd follow that with front squats, and you should rest around 2.5 to 3 minutes between those. For accessory compound movements, which are compound movements that use smaller loads, for exercises like seated row or machine press, 2-minute rests should be enough. Then for smaller accessory and isolation work such as flies and curls, you should be looking at around 90 seconds of rest between sets. Keep in mind, there's nothing magical about any of these numbers. They're only approximate guesses with what we know and what numbers have been seen to be effective in studies. If you're experienced and you know your body, you can use your own judgment to alter these times a bit. You can also experiment with rest times to see how your body responds. Now, we know these rest times are probably longer than you're used to. Therefore, what if you don't want to wait so long between sets? Or maybe you only have a limited time. What can you still do to maximize gains? We have the perfect answer for you: supersets. Supersets are when you perform 2 exercises back to back. However, the exercises used are of opposing muscle groups. Think bench press and bent over rows or curls and skull crushers. You can even pair a lower body exercise with an upper body exercise. As the exercises hit different muscles, muscle A can rest while you work muscle B. This means you're still able to let your muscles rest longer while limiting the time you're physically resting. To maximize recovery, we'd like to perform supersets a little differently. Instead of performing the movements back to back and then rest, use a consistent rest time of 1 to 1.5 minutes between each exercise. So it ends up looking like this: perform exercise A, rest for 1 to 1.5 minutes. Perform exercise B, rest for 1 to 1.5 minutes. Repeat exercise A, rest, and so on. Even though you're still resting between, ultimately this ends up saving time over doing a single exercise with long rests in between each set. But what about pump work and traditional methods of bodybuilding? You can still use things like drop sets, compound sets, and forced reps. However, keep those for the smaller muscle groups toward the end of your workout so that it doesn't affect total volume. After wading through all the research, we learned from all of it that rest, just like every other variable, should be used to maximize volume. We use moderate reps and moderate loads to assure optimal amounts of volume of sufficient intensity. Therefore, it makes sense to manipulate our rest so that it too maximizes volume, thus eliciting more muscle hypertrophy. At the same time, you don't need to fret about getting your rest just right. Waiting a little too long isn't going to throw off your training, nor is maybe missing a rep for not resting long enough once in a while. Just like everything else with hypertrophy training, it's the cumulative effect of everything you do that determines your muscle growth. Your rest time just happens to be the one variable where doing nothing for longer has its benefits. We're going to tell you something that may blow your mind. Ready? Exercise isn't the best way to lose weight.
What?
That's right, exercise is not the best way to lose weight. When you take in all considerations and variables, you actually see that using exercise to burn fat during your weight loss journey will likely yield suboptimal results. In fact, we don't even believe your main reason for exercise should be weight loss. But what are we talking about? This video is going to flip this belief upside down, but trust us, in the end it's all going to make sense. Before we start, realize that this video will be explained as if you're someone who is trying to decide what to do to lose weight. However, the same principles apply to everyone. Let's continue. So tell us, do any of these sound familiar? This program is going to melt fat like butter. Burn 1,000 calories in an hour. The best weight loss program ever. If you've ever been around gyms for any length of time, you probably heard these, or something similar, many times over. While great marketing tools, none of them are being completely honest. However, most people buy into this as we've been conditioned to equate going to the gym with weight loss. We believe that the main purpose of the gym is to lose weight and burn fat and melt calories and all that. If you were to ask most people why they're going to the gym, it's going to be to lose weight. This is one of the reasons why cardio equipment is the most popular equipment in the gym. However, is this practice steering people down the wrong direction? We think so. We suggest that this mentality could result in disappointment. To be clear, we're not saying the gym won't help you lose weight, or even that it's bad to use the gym to lose weight. We're only saying that there's a better mindset. Again, it'll all make sense at the end. To understand this conundrum, first you need to understand how you lose weight. A very basic explanation is you simply need to burn more calories than you consume. Now, we understand there's plenty of nuance in that statement, and that there certainly are variables that need to be accounted for. However, for the sake of this video, this basic understanding is enough for our situation. So again, to lose weight, you must burn more calories than you consume. This means there are 2 variables that you can use to control calories: activity and diet. Consuming calories refers to any amount of food you eat. Our diet is composed of 3 macronutrients: protein, fat, and carbohydrates. These are the nutrients that you need to consume in sufficient quantities to support a healthy life. At the same time, these macros are also where you get your calories from. 1 gram of protein has 4 calories, 1 gram of fat has 9 calories, and 1 gram of carbohydrates also has 4 calories. The total amount of these macronutrients that you eat every day will determine your total calorie consumption. Now, burning calories is a bit more complicated, with a few more moving parts to consider. The total amount of calories you burn daily is known as your total daily energy expenditure, or TDEE. To calculate your TDEE, there are 4 different variables to consider. First and largest variable is your basal metabolic rate, or BMR. This is the total amount of calories you need just to support life. The easiest way to think about this is that this is the amount of calories you'd burn if you just laid in your bed completely still all day long, like some of y'all did last Sunday. While we usually associate exercise with calorie loss, in reality every single body process requires energy. This includes brain function, respiration, digestion, your heart pumping, everything. That's what makes this the largest chunk of your calories that you burn daily. Apart from a few extreme athletes, your BMR accounts for 60 to 70% of your TDEE. The second variable is called your thermic effect of food, or TEF. Have you heard the myth that eating celery burns more calories than what's in it? Well, if you have, it's not true, but the gist of it does have some truth to it. TEF is the amount of calories used to digest, absorb, transport, and dispose of food. For example, carbs have a TEF of 10%, meaning that if you eat 100 calories from carbs, your body uses 10 calories to digest, absorb, and transport nutrients. On average, this accounts for 10% of your TDEE. Then we have the third and fourth variables. We'll speak about these together as they have the most variability. Plus, they're the 2 variables you have significant control over. These 2 variables are EAT, exercise activity thermogenesis, and NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Together, we could simply call these your activity levels, but they are distinctly different. EAT is the amount of calories you burn through exercise, that is, an activity you choose to perform that's not essential for life but for enjoyment. This is where exercise and the gym fall short. When taking everyone into account, this number can vary quite a bit. For some extreme athletes, it might account for 30 to 40%. However, for most people, this only accounts for 5 to 10%. On the other hand, NEAT refers to all the activities you do that are not for exercise. This includes things like walking through the mall, getting out of bed, brushing your teeth, going to the park to take pictures, or clicking on this video. If you have ever heard of the 10,000 steps, it's really talking about increasing NEAT. Now, most people completely underestimate this low-intensity movement, but it builds up over the day. In fact, on average, NEAT makes up 15% of your TDEE. However, TDEE can vary a lot from person to person. For example, someone working in an office will move around much less than a construction worker. Okay, as we now know what your TDEE is, let's go back to losing weight. So, to lose weight, we would then need to use a formula or a calculator to complete your TDEE. We need to keep in mind your TDEE includes the number of calories you burn from exercise. So basically, if you train 6 times a week, your TDEE will be more than if you train 2 times a week. For example, if you train twice a week, maybe yours is 3,000 calories, while it might be 3,150 if you train 6 times a week. So, to lose weight, you must eat less than your TDEE. As you see, training more allows you to eat slightly more and still lose weight, or you could eat the same amount and lose more weight, or a third option. But before we get into that, we need to speak about a topic often lost when discussing weight loss. People will talk about weight loss as if they can burn thousands and thousands of calories daily with no ill effects. This does not happen. In reality, if you go too far into a caloric deficit, you put yourself at risk of losing muscle mass. When going into any deficit, your body is going to need to find energy. Under normal circumstances, your body will simply draw from your fat stores, and that would suffice. However, in a large deficit, your body will really be scavenging for energy, and drawing from your fat stores may not be enough. Therefore, your body will break down muscle so it can use the amino acids for energy. Further, if you go into a large deficit for too long, it can also have some other unintended consequences, such as lowering your metabolism as a means to conserve energy. Therefore, the majority of experts recommend a person get into a slight 300 to 500 caloric deficit daily to see healthy weight loss. This amount will allow steady weight loss while minimizing the risk of any negative effects. Now these 500 calories can come from either increasing physical activity, cutting out calories, or the third option, cutting out calories and increasing physical activity. This brings us back to our main focus, explaining why exercise is not the best way to lose weight. We need to clarify what we mean, as there are a bit of semantics involved. We're saying that exercise is not the best way. We're not saying exercise doesn't play a part. In fact, it plays a very important part. Numerous studies show that diet plus exercise is better for losing weight compared to just diet alone or just exercise alone. So, it's not that exercise isn't good for losing weight, it's your mindset in the role that exercise plays that's important. Let us explain what we mean. Generally speaking, when people use exercise to lose weight, they'll follow a program that's designed to lose weight. Kind of a no-brainer, right? These programs usually consist solely of cardio, aerobics, possibly HIIT or circuit-style training, if you're lucky. So what's wrong with that? Well, these styles of training are not bad in the least, and we believe everyone's program should include a bit of it all. However, when that's all you do, you waste your gym's primary purpose, which is to build strength and increase muscle mass or maintain muscle mass. As we stated above, you have two ways to adjust your calories, by your nutrition and by activity. This means you already have nutrition to cut calories from your diet, and remember it's only 500. Therefore, you don't really need to use the gym to burn the extra surplus of calories, as that's what your diet should primarily be for. And unlike cutting calories, which can be done with your nutrition, there's no other way to build or maintain muscle if you don't do it at the gym. Remember what we said at the beginning of this video about going into a deficit. Your muscle can break down. In reality, this is always a risk when in a deficit, big or small. However, if you stay in an appropriate deficit and follow a strength and muscle building program at the gym, any muscle loss that may occur will be heavily mitigated. Again, you're unable to do this if you exercise for calorie burn rather than muscle gain. Therefore, instead of going to the gym to burn calories, you should go to the gym to either build muscle or maintain muscle. But with that said, it's also important to realize another factor: you're still going to burn calories by lifting weights. Just because you don't go to the gym specifically to burn calories, it doesn't mean you're not going to burn calories. Of course you are. Now, it's true that you would probably burn more calories by doing cardio for an hour. There are a ton of variables, but 600 calories an hour is a good estimate. So now let's look at weightlifting. Again, a ton of variables, but burning 200 to 300 calories from lifting weights is a pretty good estimate. So obviously there are other ways to burn more calories in the gym. However, this brings us to another extremely important aspect: you can't out-train a bad diet. We're sure you've heard this before, but it needs to be repeated and understood. Think about it. Originally, you became overweight from overeating. In fact, everyone throughout history has become overweight from overeating. This means that your diet is the primary problem. If you burn 500 calories at the gym but then eat an extra slice of pizza because you're a little extra hungry, you just ruined it. Therefore, if you use the gym to lose all your calories, you aren't fixing your real problem, your nutrition. Remember, you will never gain weight from not working out enough. Rather, you always gain weight from eating too much. Weight loss is not a product of how much you train, but how much you eat. Making exercise the main tool ignores this fact. Therefore, if you never get control of your diet, you're always at risk of regaining fat. And many do. And it won't come from not working out enough. Further, you don't want to get in the habit of, quote, burning off a late night. It's not uncommon for people to go to the gym because they ate too much the night before. Therefore, you must control your diet. If you control your diet, you don't need to worry about burning thousands and thousands of calories. Rather, you can concentrate on lifting to maintain your beautiful muscles. During your weight loss journey, you should use the gym to maintain muscle mass and use your nutrition to control your calories. Do you see the subtle difference? It's not saying that you can't use the gym in your weight loss journey. In fact, we strongly recommend that you do. However, burning calories is simply a bonus. It's not its purpose. On the contrary, you use your nutrition to lower your calories. And this concept is true if you're gaining weight, losing weight, or maintaining it. In fact, many high-caliber coaches won't even adjust a program of a long-term client based on if they're gaining or losing weight. Now, this doesn't mean that there won't be any alteration at all. It just means there are not two completely different programs. So now you understand the title of this video. Of course, we think that using exercise in your weight loss journey is a good move. In fact, we think you should, and to prove this, we're going to list just a few awesome benefits you get from lifting weights while losing weight. 1. It may help build muscle if you're new to training. 2. It'll help mitigate muscle loss if you've been training for some time. 3. It'll burn extra calories. 4. It can improve executive function, which can lead to better nutrition choices. 5. It sets you up for a healthy lifestyle. 6. It will increase bone strength. And 7. It can improve your hormone profile. We could keep going, but you get the point. Lifting weights is awesome when used correctly. So this begs the question, how should you lose weight? As mentioned, your training doesn't have to change at all. You could use the same program you used when gaining weight while losing weight. This probably flies in the face of everything you've ever been taught, but it's true. As we just went over in this video, your primary goal when getting to the gym while losing weight is to mitigate muscle loss. While there are admittedly no scientific studies to back this next part up, there's a theory amongst strength coaches that you should primarily use compound movements with heavy loads while losing weight, 85 to 95% of your 1-rep max, or the most you can lift. The reason you do compound movements is threefold. For one, you don't need to worry about isolation exercises as they are predominantly used to build muscle. As you're not necessarily interested in gaining muscle while losing weight, isolations don't have as much of a purpose. To be clear, doing one isolation per joint is always a good idea just to maintain your joint health. You just don't need to do 4 variations of bicep curls in the same session. Secondly, while we literally just had a whole video on why your training shouldn't be designed to burn calories, using compound exercises will burn more calories in the long run. That's why we said secondly, as it's more like a bonus rather than the reason. But still, compound exercises use more muscle mass, which will translate to extra calories burned. The third, and again, while there are no studies to actually back this claim up, there is a theory that heavy compound exercise will better promote the need to maintain muscle. Now, once you get in your heavy lifts, you could end with a circuit or a round or two of HIIT. In fact, you could just perform your isolations in a circuit. Adding a session of HIIT at the end of a session could burn a few extra calories that'll build up over time. However, it should never take precedence over weight training. And of course, remember at the very beginning when we talked about NEAT. Do not underestimate NEAT. Try to make it a point to add some light-intensity walking to your daily life, as this is especially true if you work in an office. Now, this kind of borders on the line of NEAT and EAT, but that's not the point. The point is that adding some light-intensity activity daily will make a huge difference. The more, the better, but try to do at least 30 minutes a day. Or a really easy fix is just ride your bike to the gym. Again, this will increase your calorie burn while allowing you to use the gym for weight training. If anything, realize that you don't always need to ruin yourself to burn calories. Sometimes a 60-minute walk through your local park is all you need. Let's remember that we're only trying to hit a 500-calorie deficit. We're already getting about 200 calories daily from training, so walking an extra 30 to 60 minutes daily gives us an extra 50 to 100 calories. This means now you just need to cut around 200 calories out of your diet. That's like 2 bananas. Easy. Study after study has shown that diet and exercise is always better than either exercise only or diet only. By using both, you now have 2 tools to alter your calories and a tool to maintain your muscle mass. You can then also throw in some light activity for a well-rounded plan. This will maximize the benefits and it'll be your best approach every time. So back to exercise not being the best way to lose weight. What is it? Well, dieting and lifting weights are.